Pressing his hand into the freezing snow, Ash lifted his trembling voice and questioned why they had taken him in at all, if they intended to discard him anyway. Roderick bent down and coldly told him that he should stop deceiving himself because he had never needed him from the very beginning. He roughly grabbed Ash's hair, yanking his head upward and forcing him to meet his contemptuous gaze before leaning closer to reveal the terrible truth. What he had truly needed was the power of the seven wings, sleeping within Ash's body. Ash's eyes widened in shock as he repeated the words seven wings in disbelief. Roderick's cruel smile deepened as he claimed that Ash's mother had been very useful to him. He shamelessly boasted that she had only borne Ash as the seed he required for his own benefit. The last thing Ash remembered was himself screaming desperately while demanding answers from Roderick. As cold blades pierced through his body, his consciousness slowly faded, leaving behind only a bone-chilling cold as his hands sank into the snow. In that final moment, he wondered in despair whether this was truly the end of his fate. If so, then what meaning had his entire life ever held? Suddenly, a pale and gentle warmth enveloped him, and for a fleeting second, he thought he had reached the afterlife until he realized it was snow. He felt someone holding him in their arms, a foreign warmth that was strangely tender. His eyes flew open wide. No, this was not a dream. It was reality. Confused, he wondered where he was as he lay beneath the falling snow. Horror struck him when he noticed how small his body was. Staring at his tiny hands, he questioned whether they truly belonged to him. They were not merely similar. They were the hands of a newborn child, and he was being cradled in someone's arms. He looked at the woman holding him, and noticed that she appeared to have just breathed her last, making him wonder if she was already dead. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice echoed through his mind, commanding him to seek her. In a vision, he saw knights galloping through the snowstorm while declaring that she could not have gone far. One of them shouted that by order of Duke Roderick, they had to recover the child she had taken at any cost. The vision vanished, leaving him stunned and unable to comprehend what had just happened. He remained frozen in place as the snow continued to fall around him. Then he suddenly remembered the name that had been spoken, Duke Roderick. Horror dawned on him as he realized that the people searching for the newborn were actually searching for him. The memory of being found during a raging snowstorm resurfaced in his mind, and a wild suspicion began to take root. Had he returned to the past? He tried to push the thought aside when strange flashes of light flickered before his eyes, interrupting his reflection. Though he still could not fully believe it, he decided to set the question aside for now and focus on the immediate danger. One thing was certain. If he remained there, he would once again fall into the hands of the cruel Duke. With the will of a seasoned warrior, he forced his fragile newborn body to crawl out of the cold arms of the woman who had already lost her warmth. Suddenly, a surge of golden energy burst from within him, driving his desperate resolve to flee as far away as possible. The heat from his tiny hands melted the thick snow wherever he touched it, yet the body of a newborn soon reached its limit. He collapsed into the snow, feeling his breathing grow heavier and more strained. Amid the biting cold, his limbs burned as though consumed by fire. A long trail of melted water marked his path across the white ground, but he could barely drag himself any farther. Even so, his eyes shone with unyielding determination. No matter what, he swore that he would survive. The image of his ruthless father turning his back on him resurfaced, planting a vow of vengeance deep within his heart. Clenching his teeth and pouring every ounce of hatred into his glowing hands, he swore that Roderick would pay for everything. With the last of his strength, the tiny newborn crawled with astonishing persistence, carving a long mark across the snow until, completely exhausted, he collapsed at the feet of a figure who had just appeared. A little girl pointed excitedly at the motionless child and called out to her father in delight. The man known as Viscount Highfried could not hide his shock at the sight before him. Gently, he picked up the baby, wondering how such a child could possibly have ended up in a place like this. Feeling the safety and warmth of the man's embrace, the child drifted into sleep. Viscount Highfried stared in astonishment at the strange newborn in his arms. His eyes traced the long trail left behind in the snow, and he could scarcely believe that a baby could have traveled such a distance alone. Looking down at the sleeping child, he could not help but wonder about the boy's true identity. When Ash awoke again, he found himself in a warm room far removed from the raging storm outside. Still drowsy, he questioned where he was. Suddenly, an illusion appeared before him, showing a boy with hair as red as fire reaching out his hand as though trying to take him away. Just as abruptly, a gentle pinch on his cheek pulled him out of the vision. 4 charming little girls surrounded him, and one of them excitedly announced to the eldest sister that the baby had awakened. While the eldest sister scolded the others not to ruin the baby's pretty nose, the veteran warrior, now trapped inside the helpless body of an infant, could do nothing as he found himself surrounded and handled by the lively girls. Unable to understand what was happening, he struggled helplessly in their midst. Fortunately, the eldest sister, a girl with platinum hair, rescued him from the others' clutches. Even so, he curled up in her lap with suspicion in his eyes. Suddenly, with the will of an adult trapped inside him, he attempted to stand and free himself from the girl's arms. But his fragile newborn body betrayed him at once, causing him to fall face first onto the floor and shock everyone in the room. One of the girls cried out in alarm, unable to comprehend what on earth was happening. Startled and frustrated, Ash began crawling frantically while wondering why the girls were chasing after him and shouting for him to stop. The comical pursuit ended only when his tiny body could no longer endure the effort, and he was finally caught. Viscount Highfried scooped him up just in time and remarked in astonishment that he truly was a strange child for having fallen from the sky like that. Ash's eyes widened as he froze the moment he recognized the man holding him. This was Viscount Highfried, the brother of Duke Roderick. Shocked, he looked around at his surroundings and wondered whether this place was another residence of the Elmsheim family. Elmsheim, lord of the Viscount's house and head of a lesser branch of the Elmsheim family, had once stood alongside his brother Roderick. They were known as the Twin Wings, the two right hands entrusted with protecting the royal family. Yet in the memories Ash carried from his previous life, Viscount Highfried had died tragically during a civil war, bringing about the downfall of his entire house. Seeing Viscount Highfried alive and standing before him, Ash could finally be certain that he truly had returned to the past. Even so, he could not help clutching his head at the bitter irony. In trying to escape the Duke's household, he had fallen directly into the hands of his own brother. Meanwhile, Viscount Highfried, who still held him gently, speculated that perhaps the child's magic had gone out of control and caused him to fly. Convinced that he was no ordinary baby, his wife looked at Ash with tender eyes and a warm smile completely unlike the cruelty he remembered. She hugged him softly, comforting him and assuring him that he must have been very frightened, but that everything would be all right now. For the first time in both of his lives, Ash felt the warmth of a mother's embrace, leaving him stunned and speechless. From a short distance away, Viscount Highfried smiled in quiet satisfaction as he watched the scene. He stepped closer and declared that the child harbored extraordinary power and that the mark on his body was the clearest proof. As Viscount Highfried lifted the baby's sleeve before a mirror, a bright red mark came into view. The Viscount gasped in horror and whispered in disbelief that the mark was the 7 wings. Ash immediately went rigid, unable to understand why the mark of the 7 wings had appeared on his body. At that very moment, fragments of dreadful memories from his previous life surged back like crashing waves. He fully awakened to the truth. Roderick's words echoed endlessly in his mind. What he had truly needed was the power of the 7 wings hidden within Ash's body. From the very beginning, he had never intended to raise him as a son. He had taken him in for one purpose only, to steal the 7 wings, and yet he had still dared to call him wingless. After having his own wings torn away in his previous life, anger erupted in Ash's heart like a blazing fire. Back in the present, noticing the sudden change in his expression, Viscount Highfried spoke with concern before turning to his wife and asking what they intended to do with the child. Hearing this, Ash inwardly realized that the situation was becoming extremely dangerous. He could not allow this power to fall into the hands of the Elmsheim family once again. He needed it for himself. He needed it to take revenge on that man. Then, without hesitation, Viscount Highfried made a decision. He declared that he would adopt the child, causing Ash to lift his gaze in shock. Stunned by such an unexpected and unbelievable statement, Ash watched as Viscount Highfried slowly extended his hand without the slightest trace of malice in his eyes. He gently patted the boy's head and explained that the child was still a little bird who could not yet fly on his own, and that he would raise him until the day he could spread his wings and soar freely. Something complex flickered within Ash's glassy eyes before quietly fading away. This kind of kindness was something he had never experienced before. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the room. One of Viscount Highfried's daughters, who had been secretly eavesdropping outside the door, had fallen over. The Viscount turned sharply and sternly questioned whether 2 of his daughters had been listening in, but it turned out that it was not just 2. All 4 sisters had been stacked together in a clumsy pile after collapsing on top of one another. The eldest daughter awkwardly stood up, scratching her head while explaining that they had simply been too worried about the baby. Amid the warm family atmosphere, a red-haired girl looked curiously at her mother. Pointing at the newborn in her arms, she excitedly asked what his name would be. Viscount Highfried smiled gently as she gazed tenderly at the child, lifting him slightly beneath the soft glow of the moonlight. She gave him the name Astor, saying that it meant a new star had been born into their family. Time passed swiftly. 10 years later, within a splendid mansion, Viscount Highfried, now visibly older, arrived and was greeted by a soldier's respectful bow. Behind him, a nimble young attendant stepped forward to open the door of a luxurious carriage. It was Astor. The once helpless infant had grown into a handsome and elegant young man as he descended from the vehicle. Turning politely, he extended his hand to help a red-haired girl step down, while gently reminding Miss Alphine to be careful. The young lady smiled brightly and thanked Astor, and for a brief moment, the mischievous expression she had worn during childhood resurfaced in his memory. Astor watched his sister Alphine's back with quiet affection, his gaze carrying maturity and confidence. Together they walked toward the venue of an important event. They were heading to the Sword Dance Festival, an annual gathering hosted by the Duke House of Elmsheim for noble knight families. On the surface, it was an occasion meant to strengthen ties among the nobility, but in truth, it was also a ruthless arena of rivalry between houses. Each family presented the strength of their young swordsmen, who carried the honor of their entire lineage upon their shoulders. The moment Astor and Alphine entered the grand hall, every gaze turned toward them. Whispers rippled through the crowd as mocking comments slowly began to rise. Voices laced with subtle disdain spread throughout the hall, as the nobles spoke of how the Viscount's house had come only to humiliate itself. They mocked the family for adopting a brat of unknown origin instead of producing a proper heir. Among the crowd, hostile and malicious glances questioned how far the Viscount's family intended to tarnish the reputation of the Elmsheim name. Astor stood still with his gaze fixed upon the imposing castle before him, lost in thought. Noticing his silence, Alphine anxiously squeezed his hand and told him not to pay attention to the cruel whispers surrounding them. Clenching her teeth, she firmly explained that in a place like this, anyone who showed weakness would be crushed first. Astor remained quiet as he calmly surveyed the hostility surrounding them without the slightest change in expression. Behind him, Viscount Hyfryd spoke in a low and steady voice, explaining that this was the current standing of their house. Standing before the majestic ducal castle, he explained that he wanted Astor to witness this harsh reality with his own eyes. Then he turned toward his son and asked whether he felt disappointed. Astor slightly turned his head as a confident and faintly defiant smile curved across his lips. He calmly replied that he was not disappointed at all, and that the atmosphere actually suited him perfectly. Hearing his son's firm answer, Viscount Hyfryd burst into proud laughter, clearly at ease. Suddenly, painful memories from Astor's previous life flooded back into his mind. The shame of his house being utterly defeated and humiliation resurfaced vividly. This very place had once been the stage of his greatest disgrace, a hall filled with bitter memories. But now, after regaining the Seven Wings, everything was different. A flame of determination burned within his golden eyes, signaling that revenge was finally about to begin. Standing beside his father and sister Alphine, Astor lifted his gaze toward the towering ducal castle, a structure burdened with the weight of his painful past. From above, the two half-brothers from his former life looked down upon him with arrogance and contempt. Despite their humiliating stares, Astor's expression remained perfectly composed. Beneath his fringe rested an extraordinary calmness. Now was the time to step forward with dignity and face everything. Confidence gleamed in Astor's eyes as he silently thought that it was time to make a spectacular entrance. Inside the grand hall, an intense fencing competition unfolded upon the central stage, capturing the full attention of the gathered nobles. In an era where knights reigned supreme, they were expected to embody both overwhelming power and noble grandeur. Power was displayed through masterful swordsmanship, while grandeur stemmed from the fame and standing of one's house. At the center of the hall, two young swordsmen clashed in a fierce duel, their movements overflowing with explosive energy. They charged toward one another and closed the distance instantly for a decisive collision. What followed was the perfect embodiment of strength and splendor, the manifestation of magical energy itself. With a single precise strike, one combatant shattered his opponent's sword into pieces. The defeated youth's face froze in disbelief just before he collapsed. The victor proudly rose, revealing the absolute symbol of his family's lineage, the wing emblem. On the back of his hand, the emblem of the two wings glowed with a bluish light, irrefutable proof of his power. From the balcony above, Astor watched the scene in silence, his gaze steady and unreadable as he maintained perfect composure. He inwardly admitted that this place was just as intimidating as it had always been. It was no wonder his other sisters had firmly refused to attend such a hostile gathering. Ignoring the mocking stares that he recognized all too well from his previous life, Astor's resolve hardened like steel. A bitter memory continued to haunt him, the image of his humiliating defeat within this very hall. Noticing that his gaze had drifted far away, Alphine gently called his name with genuine concern. She carefully asked whether he was nervous since this was his first sword dance festival. However, Astor smiled with unusual confidence and explained that he was not nervous at all. If anything, the place simply felt nostalgic to him. His strange answer left Alphine completely confused, unable to understand what he truly meant. At that moment, Viscount Hyfryd excused himself, explaining that he needed to attend a conference before entrusting Astor with taking care of Alphine. Indignant, Alphine protested and reminded her father that she was actually 1 year older than Astor. Astor lightly teased her, saying that she was far too clumsy to be trusted alone. Viscount Hyfryd placed a hand on Astor's shoulder and advised him to take advantage of the opportunity to make connections since many young nobles his age were present. Then, lowering his voice, he seriously warned him not to let anyone discover the truth about the Seven Wings. As the Viscount walked away, Astor fell into deep thought while carefully weighing his adoptive father's warning. Yet the looks directed toward him from every corner of the hall were filled with barely concealed hostility. He realized that in such an openly unfriendly atmosphere, forming connections as his father had suggested would be nearly impossible. But instead of shrinking back, a cold determination settled into his golden eyes. When Alphine noticed him walking away, she anxiously asked where he was going. Without even turning around, Astor calmly answered that he was simply going to make some friends. With steady strides, he descended the grand staircase and headed directly toward a group of young nobles chatting on a sofa. The red-haired youth leading the group looked at him with disdain before demanding to know who he was. Astor bowed slightly with a confident smile and politely greeted him as Brother Dallas. He then formally introduced himself as Astor Elmine and declared that he was Dallas's younger brother. Dallas stared at him in astonishment. Casually, Astor added that he had spotted him from outside and decided to stop by and greet him personally. Another young man named Grion leaned toward Dallas and explained that this was the adopted boy whom the Viscount's house had taken in. Dallas immediately burst into mocking laughter, finally understanding why this brat had the audacity to call himself an Elmine. At that instant, memories of his past death flooded Astor's mind once again. He recognized them immediately. Dallas and Grion, the two heirs of House Elmsheim, were the very people who had killed him in his previous life. Back then, they had cast enormous shadows over his heart and seemed terrifying beyond measure. But now, as he looked at them beneath the bright lights of the hall, they appeared to be nothing more than children pretending to wield power. Sensing the tension, Alphine quickly grabbed Astor by the arm and called out to him with concern. She attempted to pull him away while insisting that he had already greeted them and that it was time to leave. Dallas's mocking voice suddenly stopped her as he addressed her with unwanted familiarity. With a sneer, he questioned whether she was still hiding behind her father again today before arrogantly ordering both of them to come closer and entertain him, declaring it an order from the main house. Alphine froze instantly, her back stiffening as she stood facing away from them. Her body trembled with tension while her eyes burned with fury at the humiliating command. She flatly refused and firmly declared that there was no master-servant relationship between the main house and their branch family. Just as she was about to step forward and act, Astor swiftly caught her wrist and stopped her from making a reckless move. Holding her firmly, he calmly explained that he had not finished speaking yet. His composed profile stood in sharp contrast to the charged atmosphere as he concealed his true intentions beneath a mask of serenity. Seeing this, Dallas's lips twisted into a sadistic grin as he decided to pour even more fuel onto the fire. He openly mocked Alphine, reminding everyone that her father, despite being a knight, had failed to protect the king, and that, as punishment, his own younger brother had cut off his arm. Each cruel word struck Alphine like a lash, forcing her to lower her head in humiliation and pain. Dallas continued mercilessly, declaring how grateful he was that he did not carry the blood of such a loser within his veins. Unable to endure the insult any longer, Alphine finally erupted in fury and demanded that he take back his words. With an angry shout, Alphine declared that she would never allow anyone to insult her father. Yet even after she lowered her head, Dallas continued his verbal assault, cruelly mocking that only useless daughters had been born into her family, girls who could never inherit a title, and that her father must surely be disappointed in them. With a vicious smile, he lifted his wineglass and reminded her that this was not a dance floor. Then he suddenly flung the wine at her, staining her dress. Grion mockingly advised her to wear rags next time so she would not have to worry about getting soaked. At that very moment, Astor stepped forward. On his way there, he had wondered whether seeing their faces again would leave him feeling nothing at all. No anger and no resentment. With a smooth motion, he snatched a bottle of wine from a startled noble standing nearby. But the moment he saw his sister standing there humiliated, her eyes brimming with tears while her bruised cheek bled faintly, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. At the very least, he realized that he could still feel anger. Calmly, he called out Dallas's name before tossing the wine bottle into the air with a provocative flick of his wrist. Just as the bottle was about to smash into Dallas's head, it suddenly halted in midair. Astor looked at him with open contempt and declared that they were still the same pieces of trash as ever. With a subtle movement of his hand, the suspended bottle transformed into a weapon ready to strike. In the next instant, it shattered violently, drenching the utterly stunned Dallas from head to toe in red wine. Astor then stood upright with chilling composure while the nobles around him stared in shock. Grion screamed Dallas's name in panic while Astor casually wiped a drop of liquid from his lips and remarked that it was only grape juice. With a twisted and contemptuous smile, he added that it was the perfect drink for noble babies like them. Naturally, they refused to believe him. Suddenly, a memory from 3 years earlier crashed into Astor's mind. He remembered an explosion of golden energy and his father's desperate voice shouting for him to control it. Amid the chaos, one of his sisters held another unconscious girl in her arms while crying through tears and begging him to stop before he killed them all. His eldest sister had desperately pleaded for him to regain control as spirals of dark and golden power coiled violently around him. He remembered the terrifying power of the Seven Wings, a force so dangerous that even he barely understood it. The image of his father surfaced in his thoughts, his face filled with worry as he questioned whether Astor would ever truly master such overwhelming power. Astor also remembered his own suffering, the energy tearing through his body while his father wondered whether either of them could endure it. Meanwhile, an attendant burst into the conference hall and shouted that something terrible had happened. The Viscount immediately interrupted and sternly demanded what could possibly be so urgent during such an important meeting. The attendant hurriedly explained in panic that the children of the main house and the Elming branch family had become involved in a duel. The Viscount and the Duke exchanged tense glances. Instantly, the Viscount leapt to his feet and rushed out of the hall, his cape billowing behind him. When he reached the balcony, he found a distressed Alphine running toward him while crying out for her father. Alarmed, he urgently questioned what had happened. Nearby, a broad man with a shark-like smile pointed toward the arena below while commenting excitedly that a fight between the great Elming brothers was underway, something rarely seen. The Viscount and Alphine leaned forward and saw Dallas facing Astor alone in the arena. The man added that depending on how the battle ended, the consequences could be enormous, a thought that visibly unsettled the surrounding nobles. With a sinister grin, the red-eyed man predicted that the dance of swords was about to turn ugly. Inside the arena, Dallas unleashed his power and fury while shouting that some fool had dared to provoke the Duke's house. He insulted Astor by calling him nothing more than a stray dog who did not understand the difference in power between them. Between the two fighters, the emblem of 4 wings on Dallas's hand glowed with a blue light, and the crowd murmured in awe, claiming that the Duke's son truly stood on an entirely different level. Pressing the tip of his sword close to Astor's face, Dallas smirked and demanded that Astor reveal his own wing emblem. He mockingly questioned whether Astor was too ashamed to display it after witnessing his power. However, Astor calmly replied that Dallas was right, and that boasting about a mere pattern truly was embarrassing. With a faint half-smile resting on his lips, he remained completely unmoved before him. Astor then added that he could never bring himself to behave in something so vulgar. A vein throbbed violently across Dallas's forehead as humiliation burned through him at Astor's unexpected insolence. Astor then calmly stated his condition. He declared that if he won, Dallas would apologize to Alphine. Dallas immediately accepted and countered with his own cruel condition, declaring that if he won, Aster would become his personal dog and work for him until he collapsed. Without another word, Dallas lunged forward with frightening speed. Their swords collided in a shower of golden sparks, the sharp clash echoing throughout the arena and signaling the beginning of a duel that was far more than a simple display. Aster shifted into a firm combat stance, his sword steady in his grip as dust and swirling wind gathered around him. His golden eyes sharpened with focus while his hand tightened around the hilt in preparation for the coming assault. Dallas, wearing a smile of superiority, unleashed his own magical energy and arrogantly declared that this was the true power of someone who actually possessed a wing emblem. With a furious shout, he launched a barrage of swift and crushing slashes that tore through the air, each strike carving powerful gusts of cutting wind in its wake. From the balcony, Alphine screamed Aster's name, her face turning pale from terror at the sheer ferocity of the attack. The broad man beside her merely smirked and remarked that young Master Dallas's swordsmanship was still immature. Even so, Dallas's overwhelming magical power more than compensated for any technical flaws. A violent surge of energy erupted from him, proving the terrifying advantage possessed by those who bore winged emblems. In his arrogance, Dallas believed that if one wing contained the magic of a candle flame, then his four wings represented a true explosion. Flames burst outward in a relentless storm of blazing strikes. He mocked Aster continuously while forcing him backward, questioning where all the boldness from earlier had disappeared. Yet Aster remained completely unshaken by the onslaught. With calm and precise movements, he blocked every single strike with frightening composure. Dallas sneered and taunted him further, asking whether he no longer intended to force an apology or whether all his earlier confidence had simply been empty words. With a furious roar, Dallas demanded that Aster reveal his true power before pouring every ounce of energy into one final strike. From the stands, a mustached noble smugly declared that the match had already been decided, but Aster answered by finally releasing his own aura. Instantly, his sword shined with radiance. The two forces collided in a massive explosion of red and golden energy. Dallas's face twisted in disbelief, unable to comprehend how his ultimate strike had been stopped so effortlessly. Aster offered him a faint half-smile and calmly remarked that he talked far too much. With one smooth and elegant motion, Aster knocked Dallas's blade aside before delivering a spinning kick that sent him flying violently across the arena. Aster landed lightly upon the ground, his body now wrapped in tendrils of golden energy while displaying a level of control Dallas could never hope to achieve. For 10 long years within the Viscount's household, Aster had trained endlessly to master his magic while patiently waiting for the day he could finally claim his revenge. That day had finally come. With a single slash, Aster released a surge of power that tore through the air. Golden light erupted as the arena trembled beneath the impact. The force from his blade exploded and sent Dallas flying backward, completely unable to withstand the attack. He crashed onto the ground, his knees striking the floor with a crack as he struggled to stand once again. In the distance, his brother Griot stared in disbelief, shocked that Dallas was pushed back and overwhelmed by the green and gold energy surrounding Aster. Dallas's face twisted in horror as he struggled to be cooked. He shouted that he possessed 4 wings, unable to accept the reality before him. Yet Aster remained completely chill guy. Golden energy flowed across the edge of his sword as he condensed all of his strength into a single point with one decisive movement. The rich kid spectators gasped in shock as the duel continued to unfold before their eyes. Some wondered aloud if Aster could truly take the dub, while others pointed out that Dallas was already being completely dominated. Then another violent burst of golden energy erupted from Aster's blade, sealing the outcome of the battle. Murmurs spread rapidly through the crowd as they realized the Elmine family still possessed someone with such terrifying power. However, Aster's aura only intensified further. Dark tendrils slowly seeped from his body as his energy climbed to an even more frightening level. From the balcony, the Viscount frowned deeply and muttered that the situation was becoming dangerous. Dallas trembled under the crushing pressure pouring from Aster's body. Suddenly, a traumatic memory from Aster's previous life resurfaced in his mind. He remembered one of his brothers severing his arm while laughing madly, the cruel sound echoing endlessly in his ears. Back in the present, golden and dark energy exploded violently from Aster's body as rage consumed him completely. Dallas desperately screamed curses while trying to resist the overwhelming force pressing down on him. From above, Alphine cried out in panic and begged her Nichan to stop, but it was already too late. The power of the 7 wings fully erupted, unleashing a massive explosion that carved a gigantic crater into the center of the arena. When the dust finally settled, the broad man stood with his arms crossed and a grave expression on his face. Aster's sword had stopped only inches away from Dallas's terrified face, embedded deeply into the ground. Seated helplessly on the floor, Dallas could do nothing except listen as Aster calmly returned his own yappings back to him. Aster advised that next time he should wear rags so he would not have to worry about getting wet. Afterward, Aster turned away and sheathed his sword with quiet confidence. He reminded himself that he was no longer the wingless failure everyone once mocked. From the balcony, Alphine watched him with relief and awe, while her heart continued pounding violently. Aster allowed himself a faint smile, knowing his sister was finally safe for now. That alone was enough to steady his mind. Suddenly, his golden eye flickered with traces of red as he sensed a new presence nearby. A figure wrapped in dark crimson energy descended heavily from above and landed in the center of the hall. Astor's expression sharpened instantly as he recognized the ominous newcomer. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was an imposing man. Duke Roderick had arrived. The spectators continued whispering in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the Viscount's youngest son had just defeated the third son of the main house. However, the atmosphere quickly turned grim because everyone understood that the main house would never ignore such public humiliation. Duke Roderick, the eighth leader of the main house, slowly descended the staircase while Dallas looked up at him with fear and relief, believing his father had come to save him. Astor, however, remained completely still. His eyes locked onto the man responsible for all the suffering and hatred buried deep inside him. The Duke silently surveyed the scene while an overwhelming aura of hostility spread through the hall. Astor immediately recognized him as the same man who had betrayed and killed him in his previous life. Despite the suffocating pressure filling the room, Dallas crawled desperately toward his father and grabbed onto his leg. Pointing at Astor with hatred-filled eyes, he insulted him as a mangy dog who dared challenge the main house and begged his father to punish him. Instead of helping his son, Roderick slammed over Dallas's arm. A horrifying scream echoed throughout the hall as bones cracked beneath the immense pressure. The young nobles stared in horror, unable to understand the Duke's cruelty toward his own child. Griot's face lost all color as he witnessed the brutal scene unfold before him. Roderick looked down at his defeated son with contempt and questioned why he was grinning like an idiot after disgracing the family. From the balcony, Highfridge desperately pleaded for Roderick to stop, but the Duke ignored him completely. He declared that anyone incapable of avenging themselves had no right to wield a sword. As he slowly raised his hand again, the grand hall fell into complete silence. Dallas trembled helplessly on the floor while humiliation and terror consumed him entirely. Yet Duke Roderick's fiercest fury was not directed at Dallas, but toward Astor standing before him. Pointing his sword directly at Astor, the Duke demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Astor did not flinch in the slightest. Calmly, he answered that Dallas had not yet apologized to his sister. Then, with astonishing boldness, he asked whether the punishment could wait until after the apology had been given. Wrapped in a menacing purple aura, Roderick laughed mockingly and questioned whether being a stray orphan taken in by the family had made Astor believe he truly belonged among the Elmines. Astor stood firm and declared that he was still the Viscount's son. He explained that his father had taught him the pride of a knight and the responsibility that came with carrying a family name, even without sharing its blood. The Duke fell silent for a brief moment as flames erupted around him. He accused Astor of tarnishing the reputation of the main house, the very pride that stood above 12,000 knights. From the balcony, the broad man remarked that the main house should understand that better than anyone else. Beside him, a young man with light blue hair commented with a faint smile that the matter could no longer be dismissed as a simple quarrel between children. Another noble gravely reminded everyone that the Duke's own father once demanded an arm as punishment for disloyalty. At that moment, the sharp edge of Duke Roderick's sword pressed coldly against Astor's throat. The Duke demanded to know what Astor intended to offer in exchange. Astor answered evenly that the battle had not been a sibling dispute but a legitimate duel. He explained that he had merely answered insults directed toward his house with his blade. The Duke's eyes burned with fury as Astor repeated his own words back to him, declaring that anyone incapable of avenging themselves had no right to wield a sword. Astor firmly stated that he had no intention of surrendering even a single finger. Above them, Alphine trembled anxiously while the broad man gently patted her head in an attempt to calm her down. The blue-haired youth chuckled in disbelief, remarking that Astor was only 10 years old and that the entire situation had to be some kind of joke. Roderick remained silent while the crimson glow in his eye dangerously. Eventually, he slowly drew his sword and declared that he understood everything clearly enough. With a commanding voice, he ordered Astor to draw his blade. Astor hesitated briefly, clearly not expecting the Duke himself to interfere. Before he could properly react, the ground beneath him exploded apart and an invisible force hurled him into the air. The Duke's sword crashed into the spot where Astor had been standing only a moment earlier, releasing a shockwave throughout the hall. Alphine nearly screamed as terror filled her eyes at the overwhelming display of power. Highfridge shouted his brother's name furiously before leaping down from the balcony to stand between Astor and the Duke. Blue light erupted from his twin swords as the weapons of the two brothers collided in a violent shower of sparks. At last, the leaders of the two houses had begun their duel. The impact of their clash thundered throughout the great hall, revealing the enormous difference in power between ordinary warriors and the heads of noble families. The Viscount quickly rushed beside Astor and urgently asked if he was injured. The Viscount's expression filled with both concern and surprise after seeing the destructive force of the attack. Astor slowly pushed himself back to his feet despite the bruises covering his body and the blood running down from his forehead. Even so, his spirit remained completely unshaken as fury and determination burned fiercely within his eyes. Meanwhile, Duke Roderick observed everything with a faint smile, seemingly satisfied with how Vince had matured. Without saying another word, he turned away from the confrontation and calmly walked back toward the stairs. With a swift leap, he landed beside his defeated son on the balcony, abandoning the battle entirely. The hall itself had already been left scarred by destruction, while lingering shockwaves continued shaking the surroundings. The Viscount silently watched the Duke leave before placing a protective hand on Astor's shoulder and firmly standing beside him. The Viscount remained visibly shaken while supporting the injured Astor in his arms and repeatedly calling his name in concern. Despite the injuries covering his body, Astor managed to smile and assured his father that he had successfully protected both his promise and the honor of their family. Relief and pride immediately appeared on the Viscount's face as he praised his son's performance. Meanwhile, Duke Roderick withdrew alongside his defeated child, leaving behind an atmosphere filled with tension. A broad man approached the Duke with a faint smile and remarked that his reaction earlier had been childish. Roderick coldly explained that allowing Astor to continue speaking freely would have completely destroyed the reputation of the main house. Womp womp. According to him, his actions had simply been the most reasonable compromise possible. Elsewhere, the nobles whispered among themselves in amazement. Astor had boldly challenged Duke Roderick himself and survived, instantly establishing himself as a rising star among the nobility. One mustached noble admitted that although the possibility of the Elmheim family dividing unsettled him, Astor could not have asked for a more successful social debut. Hidden within the shadows, another duke silently observed everything with a grim expression, fully aware that a massive era of upheaval was rapidly approaching. Back with his family, Astor was immediately greeted by Alphine's worried embrace, while his father proudly supported him. Blood still stained his face, yet a victorious smile remained visible. Astor himself seemed momentarily speechless after everything that had happened. The scene then shifted toward the training arena belonging to the Viscount House of Elmheim. Several knights stood nearby as a sparring session unfolded. One knight smiled casually while praising his master's swordsmanship and calling the performance splendid. The warrior receiving the praise was none other than Astor himself. The surrounding knights quietly remarked among themselves that Astor's swordsmanship was terrifying for someone his age. They noted that his training had become far more intense after the sword dance assembly. One knight recalled how Astor had defeated the third son of the Elmheim family, and the others could not hide their satisfaction. The main family had looked down upon the Viscount branch for years, so seeing one of their own stand proudly against them felt incredibly refreshing. As Astor continued defeating opponent after opponent, his thoughts drifted back toward the sword dance assembly. He understood that he had displayed enough power to silence everyone who once mocked his family as a disgrace to House Elmheim. Even so, he knew the real challenges still remained ahead of him, especially the Elmheim main house itself. Part of him wished he could have fought even more opponents during the gathering to test his limits further. Despite his growth, he clearly understood that he currently stood no chance of defeating Roderick Elmheim. To Astor, the wing crest itself was merely proof of magical potential, because raw talent meant nothing without proper mastery over it. Even now, he still could not fully control the power of the seven wings. If he no longer had to fear losing control and going berserk, he believed he could finally discover the true limits of his strength. With one final exchange, Astor defeated the last remaining knight. Several exhausted warriors now lay scattered across the training grounds. Astor calmly looked around and asked if anyone else wished to challenge him. Before another knight could respond, a familiar voice interrupted the training session. Alphine appeared and remarked that Astor was once again pushing himself far beyond his limits. She questioned whether he even understood the meaning of rest, before informing him that their father wanted to see him immediately. Astor quickly agreed and stated that he would head there right away. As they walked together, Astor noticed Alphine's outfit and commented on how unusual it looked on her. Alphine appeared confused at first, not understanding his meaning. Astor explained that she rarely wore that outfit because she used to dislike it for not being cute enough. Alphine responded that balance in life was important and admitted that watching Astor constantly improve had made her realize she could not remain unchanged forever either. Her words briefly caught Astor off guard, especially after she confidently pointed her training sword toward him with a smile. She declared that once he returned, they would spend much more time training together. Grinning in response, Astor accepted the challenge and politely asked her to go easy on him afterward. Some time later, Astor arrived at his father's office. After entering the room, the Viscount instructed him to sit down. Astor silently complied and took a seat across from his father with a serious expression on his face. Hyfred remarked that 10 years had already passed since Astor officially became part of their family. He admitted that he once considered waiting until Astor became older, but he now believed it was finally time to move forward. Slowly, he placed a small case onto the desk. Inside rested a ring. Hyfred revealed that the ring represented succession and symbolized the future head of the Viscount house. He then openly declared his intention to make Astor his successor. Astor immediately froze in complete shock after hearing those words. The Viscount calmly explained that he truly wanted Astor to inherit the house. As Astor already understood, the Branch family currently existed in a delicate political position. Despite everything, they still carried the Elmheim name and had responsibilities as rulers of their territory. With the burden of their lineage weighing heavily upon him, the Viscount explained that the position of heir could not remain empty forever. Astor's first concern immediately turned toward his sisters. He questioned whether they would truly accept such an important decision without resistance. The Viscount explained that his older daughters, who were currently studying at the Knights Academy, would return within 3 days, and that he planned to announce everything once the family reunited. Aster instantly pictured Marfa and Kudo, two powerful figures who would definitely not react kindly to the news. Kudo in particular would likely become furious. The Viscount quietly explained that Kudo disliked Aster simply because he had been born with the 7 wings. Hearing that explanation caused Aster's expression to harden immediately. With firm determination, he declared that he could not accept becoming the successor. Turning slightly away, he admitted that he still could not fully control his own magic, and described himself as an immature fool who had nearly killed his own sister. Within the quiet study, Aster confessed that someone like him lacked the confidence to persuade an angry sibling, much less carry the burden of leading an entire house. Because of that, he refused the honor completely. The Viscount quietly listened while a faint smile slowly appeared on his face. After a long silence, he admitted that he often questioned whether Aster was truly a child at all, because of how mature he sounded. Ignoring the refusal for the moment, the Viscount opened a long wooden box resting nearby. He explained that he originally intended to reward Aster after the sword dance assembly with the succession ring, but perhaps this item would make him happier instead. The moment Aster looked inside the box, his eyes widened in complete disbelief. He immediately asked what the weapon was. The Viscount revealed that it was the Devouring Magic Sword, a legendary blade capable of controlling the power of the 7 wings. Later, inside a secluded forest clearing, the Viscount announced that the area would be suitable for testing the weapon. Confused, Aster questioned why they had traveled so far simply to test a sword. The Viscount casually replied that it was merely a precaution before joking that Aster had a habit of destroying everything around him. He then properly introduced the weapon known as Graham, explaining that it was a legendary blade passed down only to the firstborn heirs of the Elmheim family. The Viscount explained that he personally retrieved the weapon from the main house, specifically for Aster. With a swift motion, he drew the sword from its sheath. Aster stared at the weapon in confusion, because it appeared to have no actual blade attached to the hilt. Smiling faintly, the Viscount explained that the sword completed itself through magic. The moment mana was channeled into it, a crimson ethereal blade would manifest from the handle. As he demonstrated, a glowing red spectral edge burst forth instantly, leaving Aster speechless in amazement. The Viscount described it as a true blade of power that responded directly to the wielder's magic itself. With one casual swing, he unleashed a massive shockwave that tore through the forest. Trees split apart instantly, while wind and debris exploded outward, displaying the terrifying strength hidden within the weapon. However, the Viscount warned that anyone with mediocre magical power would quickly be drained dry by the sword, making it a devouring blade in every sense of the word. Holding the glowing crimson hilt toward Aster, he asked whether his son wished to try wielding it himself. Without hesitation, Aster grasped the weapon as his hands closed over his father's in a symbolic moment of trust. The instant his fingers touched the hilt, his magic reacted violently. Golden energy erupted around him while countless tendrils of power intertwined directly with the sword itself. His mana poured uncontrollably into the weapon, creating a violent storm of energy, powerful enough to shake the surroundings. The overwhelming sensation stole his breath entirely. Back at the training grounds, a massive beam of crimson light suddenly pierced into the heavens, leaving everyone staring upward in shock. One knight gasped and wondered if a comet had fallen from the sky, but another immediately shouted that the opposite had happened, and that something had instead launched upward. Watching from a distance, Alphine heard the commotion and instantly recognized the energy being described. Despite the vague explanation, she knew without a doubt that the source of the disturbance was Aster himself. Inside the forest, Aster collapsed onto the ground in complete exhaustion while still wearing a smile filled with amazement. He breathlessly admitted that the sword was truly extraordinary. The Viscount looked toward his son with both awe and seriousness before explaining that the truly remarkable thing was not the weapon itself, but the overwhelming power sleeping within Aster. With a grave expression, he revealed that throughout the entire history of the Elmheim family, not a single person had ever possessed a 7-winged emblem before him. The Viscount assured Aster that if he could someday fully master that power, he would become a swordsman far superior to 6-winged warriors such as himself and even Roderick Elmheim. The image of Roderick flashed through Aster's mind, and the desire to surpass him ignited a burning determination. However, his father warned him that such overwhelming power would always attract conflict. As Aster tightened his grip around the hilt, the Viscount explained that if others discovered he possessed 7 wings, the emblems shining across his back like a beacon, many would envy him, while others would seek to destroy him like shadows dragging him into darkness. Some would try to manipulate him through schemes, while others would see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Reaching out his hand, the Viscount urged him to master his power so that when the decisive moment arrived, he would not regret his own helplessness. With unwavering conviction, he encouraged his adoptive son to grow stronger. Aster accepted his father's hand, his heart filled with gratitude, and silently swore that he would never again live the miserable life he once endured. Looking directly into his father's eyes, he sincerely thanked him, and vowed that he would master the 7 wings no matter the cost. 3 days later, the Viscount and his wife waited in the grand hall to welcome home their returning daughters. 2 young baddies showed up, one with short red hair and a fierce expression, while the other had long white hair and a gentle smile. The red-haired girl proudly announced that Kudravka had returned. After clearing her throat, she spread her arms wide with a bright grin and invited her younger sisters to embrace her. Instead, the two girls rushed straight toward the white-haired sister Malfa, happily welcoming her home and leaving Kudo standing alone in the center of the hall. Blinking in confusion, Kudo wondered why nobody was hugging her. The younger girls explained while clinging to Malfa that Kudo always ruined their hair. Crossing her arms in annoyance, Kudo denied the accusation and insisted that she had perfectly mastered a knight's etiquette and would never act improperly. However, her serious facade immediately collapsed the moment she spotted her sister Alphine. With an excited shout, she rushed forward and wrapped her in a crushing embrace, nearly suffocating her while asking if she had behaved well during her absence. Alphine struggled desperately to escape the overwhelming hug and demanded to know why she was being treated so roughly. Meanwhile, Kudo continued her overly enthusiastic greeting. Beside them, Malfa noticed someone was missing and asked where Aster was. The Viscount answered with a mysterious smile, simply referring to him as that boy. Instantly, Kudo's expression changed from cheerful warmth to serious focus. Deep within the forest, a violent pillar of red energy erupted from Aster's sword. He struggled desperately to control the overwhelming force, repeatedly leaping and swinging the blade in an attempt to subdue it. Eventually, he collapsed to his knees, exhausted and drenched in sweat, cursing his inability to fully master the weapon while remaining unaware that his sister was already searching for him. A single strand of his hair had turned white from the strain. Although he could create a blade through magic, suppressing the sword's true power consumed nearly all of his strength. The forest clearing around him was scarred with craters, clear evidence of his struggle to control the gram, making him wonder how his father wielded it so effortlessly. Suddenly, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts and teased him for pushing himself so hard again. Startled, Aster turned toward his sister Kudo and asked when she had returned. Wearing a playful yet sharp smile, she scolded him for failing to welcome his older sister home. Raising an eyebrow, she questioned whether he believed himself so important that his family no longer mattered. She mentioned hearing about the sword dance and explained that the Knight Academy was filled with rumors about him, adding that their father must be proud. Aster brushed aside the praise and insisted that she was the truly impressive one. He pointed out that even as an apprentice, she had distinguished herself through numerous missions. Continuing to praise her achievements, he mentioned hearing that she had become the only knight to receive the Medal of Honor that year. Kudo responded indifferently and remarked that if she could not achieve at least that much, she would never inherit their father's position. Fixing him with a steady gaze, she directly asked whether he had rejected the offer to become heir for her sake. Aster sighed and complained that their father should never have told her, explaining that he simply did not consider himself qualified yet. Kudo lowered her gaze thoughtfully before turning away and walking deeper into the forest. Bitterly, she complained that both their father and Aster were cruel because they knew inheriting the position had always been her dream, yet they still offered it to him. Her figure slowly disappeared among the trees, leaving Aster confused by her sudden shift in mood. Without warning, she spun around and unleashed a powerful slash of blue energy directly toward him. The attack sliced a tree in half as though it were nothing, forcing Aster to dodge at the last second. The massive trunk crashed beside him, making him leap backward to avoid being crushed. After landing lightly, he demanded to know what she was suddenly doing. Surrounded by a blazing aura of power, Kudo declared with a challenging smile that she would finally test him after all this time. Resting her sword on her shoulder, she warned him that she would no longer hold back. Panic flashed across Aster's face as he pleaded for her to wait, explaining that his sword was still incomplete. In response, Kudo questioned whether he could use the same excuse against an enemy on the battlefield. The word enemy echoed through Aster's mind, forcing him to realize the situation. Taking a combat stance, Kudo reminded him that a knight must always remain prepared for battle, and warned that if he continued holding back, she would crush him. Her first strike was so powerful that he barely managed to evade it. Realizing she was completely serious, he understood that he had no choice left. Driven by desperation, he unleashed the crimson power of Gram. Red energy from his blade collided violently against the blue aura surrounding Kudo, and a terrifying realization crossed his mind. She truly intended to kill him. Their battle raged deeper into the forest, far from prying eyes. From a distance, it looked as though lightning itself had descended among the trees, as bursts of light flashed endlessly. Clicking her tongue mid-swing, Kudo sliced through the air with merciless precision and admitted that Aster remained exceptionally skilled with the sword. She confessed that she had never expected him to keep pace with her after all the growth she had achieved at the Knight Academy. Even so, Aster continued blocking her relentless strikes one after another, until Kudo twisted her stance and unleashed a crushing blow that hurled him backward. Coldly, she declared that his control over mana was pathetic. Aster slid across the ground, his boots carving deep grooves into the soil. Yet, despite the overwhelming pressure, he forced himself to remain standing. Looking up at her, he remarked that she was just as merciless as he remembered. His thoughts drifted unwillingly to the past. Kudo had always been fierce, confrontational, and unyielding. As the only man in the family with the formal right to inherit and the bearer of the seven-winged crest, he stood above everyone else in the household. To her, his very existence had always been unfair. He had remained a silent thorn in her life for as long as she could remember. Over time, she grew into a storm that challenged every injustice placed before her, making her his natural enemy. Suddenly, she leapt high into the air, and for a brief instant, Aster saw her silhouette rise above the forest canopy. He immediately understood what was coming next. Her sword descended like judgment itself, crashing into the earth with terrifying force. The impact split the forest floor apart as a violent shockwave erupted outward. Standing above him, she declared that he was unworthy of becoming the next head of the family. Elsewhere, inside their father's chamber, Alpine stood beside the window, her voice filled with concern as she questioned whether it was truly wise to allow the two of them to fight alone. She feared that a reckless clash between siblings could easily end in death. Their father answered calmly that Aster and Kudo were rivals, reckless perhaps, but not foolish enough to cross that final line. Though still uneasy, Alpine pressed further, asking why they had truly been summoned back from the Night Academy. She sensed the matter involved more than simple succession. Their father quietly opened a drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, bearing the insignia of the Elmhine main family. The sight stole her breath away. He explained that it was a summons from the elders who governed the family's core. They wished to meet their grandchild personally. When Alpine quietly questioned whether the situation was truly that serious, he answered without hesitation that, at worst, they could lose Aster entirely. Back in the forest, the battle showed no sign of slowing. Their blades clashed repeatedly, shockwaves rippling through the trees like the heartbeat of destruction itself. Amid the exchange, Aster told Kudo to stop speaking nonsense and reminded her that he had already rejected the position of successor. He insisted that she understood that better than anyone else. Irritation twisted across her face as she raised her sword high into the air, declaring that his refusal was exactly what she found unacceptable. Her blade crashed downward with overwhelming force. Aster barely blocked the strike in time, and the sheer weight behind it stunned him. Facing her felt less like fighting a swordsman and more like resisting a troll swinging a massive warhammer. She pressed harder, pouring even more strength into the attack. At the final moment, Aster twisted his wrist and redirected her strike into the ground. He sharply demanded that she finally listen to him. She only gave a faint smile and asked whether he was already trying to run away. In the next instant, she unleashed her full brute strength, sending Aster flying sideways into a tree with enough force to shatter the bark behind him. He coughed blood, disbelief flashing across his eyes. Kudo looked down at him and declared that if all he could do was swing a sword, then he was merely third-rate. She explained that even warriors who relied only on mana could only reach second-rate, while true first-rate fighters mastered both swordsmanship and mana together. She admitted that she was deeply disappointed in him. The difference in wing crests, she explained, directly reflected mana capacity. Even a single additional wing represented nearly triple the power. Though she possessed only 5 wings and technically stood below his 7 in raw potential, he still avoided direct clashes of strength and instead hid behind refined technique. With a faint smile, she questioned whether he truly lacked faith in himself or whether he feared losing control again like he had 3 years ago. Her words cut deeper than steel. Aster froze as the memory resurfaced in his mind. For the first time, he began questioning whether he had unconsciously sealed away his own power out of fear from that incident. His gaze lowered toward his sword as he quietly wondered whether that suppression was the reason Kudo had always felt unstable in his grasp. Kudo's expression hardened even further. She declared that he possessed everything she had ever wanted, and if he intended to waste those blessings through ignorance and arrogance, then he should hand them over to someone who truly understood their worth. She lunged forward, her killing intent no longer restrained. This time, Aster refused to retreat. He met her full-powered strike head-on, their blades colliding with a thunderous roar that echoed throughout the forest. To Kudo's shock, she was forced backward, her footing faltering as disbelief filled her eyes. She could barely comprehend that he had deflected her attack so cleanly. Aster offered a faint smile and thanked her, explaining that because of her, he had finally awakened. Then he surged forward at full speed. Kudo narrowed her eyes in confusion, unable to understand why he would charge recklessly before stabilizing his blade. She questioned whether he had already run out of mana, though even that seemed impossible. As Aster advanced, mana flooded violently into his sword. The 7 wings on his back unleashed a vast, nearly inexhaustible reserve of power. He understood that he still lacked precise control over it, so instead of forcing restraint, he abandoned it entirely. Rather than relying on technique, he poured every ounce of mana into the pure motion of his strike. The attack descended with unstoppable force. Kudo blocked it cleanly and steadied herself immediately. Yet even then, she could feel the difference. Something inside Aster had undeniably changed. Kudo steadied herself after blocking the strike and let out an amused smile. She questioned whether he had truly thought this through or if he was simply acting on another reckless impulse. Aster met her gaze without hesitation. There was no uncertainty left within him now. He declared that he no longer intended to waste his second life. This time, he would claim everything that had once slipped through his fingers: the power of the 7 wings, the sword Graham, and even his rightful place within the family. These were all things he had desperately struggled for in the past, yet failed to obtain. At the mention of a second life, Kudo stiffened for the briefest moment as shock flickered visibly across her face. In that tiny opening, Aster moved. Mana surged violently into his blade as he crossed the distance in an instant. He leapt high into the air, gathering every ounce of power he possessed, his sword poised to descend. Then, suddenly, he vanished. Kudo's eyes widened as she lost sight of him mid-air. However, Aster had not disappeared at all. Instead, he had dropped low to the ground while compressing his mana into an even denser current. The pressure surrounding him intensified as he poured everything into the blade. He openly declared that he would no longer hold back. Kudo immediately sensed the shift as the air itself became unbearably heavy. She understood instantly that the battle was about to end. Aster brought his sword down with overwhelming force, the air screaming apart beneath the descending arc of mana. Sometime later, Kudo slowly opened her eyes, only to find herself staring at the familiar ceiling of her own room instead of the forest. For a brief moment, she could not understand how she had ended up there. Sunlight filtered through the curtains while her older sister, Malfa, stood quietly beside the window. Malfa turned toward her and calmly remarked that Kudo had taken quite a while to wake up. Kudo immediately pushed herself upright and sharply demanded to know what had happened to the duel and who had won. Malfa smiled gently and explained that Aster had personally carried her back. He had told everyone that Kudo simply fell asleep in the middle of the fight because the exhaustion from returning from the Night Academy had finally overwhelmed her. Kudo lowered her gaze toward her sword in silence. She knew that explanation was false. She remembered the final moment clearly. Aster's blade had stopped only inches away from her body. She had felt the crushing pressure of his mana, powerful enough to split her apart. Yet just before the strike connected, he dispersed the mana surrounding the blade. Only the remaining shockwave brushed against her, knocking her unconscious. In that instant, she realized something simple and undeniable. No matter what he claimed, Aster would never kill his own sister, and yet, for a brief heartbeat, she had truly believed he might. A faint smile touched her lips. Despite being younger than her, he had grown into someone overwhelmingly formidable. What an unbearable little brother he had become. She rose abruptly while gripping her sword and asked Malfa where Aster had gone. She declared that she would never accept a duel ending in such a way, and insisted that the next battle would begin with both of them fighting seriously from the start. Malfa's expression shifted slightly as she explained that Aster had already left the castle. Kudo froze where she stood. Malfa continued by explaining that the main house had summoned him, and earlier that day, he had departed alongside their father. Seeing the confusion on Kudo's face, she questioned whether Kudo truly had not known about the summons. Anger immediately rose within Kudo as she demanded to know why nobody had informed her about it. Meanwhile, a horse-drawn carriage rolled steadily along the forest road beyond the castle grounds. Inside, Aster sat silently across from his father. His father explained that the person Aster was about to meet was one of the old lords who secretly supported the Elmheim family. Although those figures had long stepped down from public leadership, the former heads of both the main and branch families, along with the powerful elders beneath them, still possessed overwhelming authority. They no longer stood beneath the spotlight, but instead ruled quietly from the shadows. He added that those elders had never once shown any interest in Aster after his adoption, so for them to summon him now was far from trivial. Aster listened calmly and replied that it was most likely related to the sword dance assembly. He mentioned hearing that the elders of Elmheim valued the family's honor above everything else, above gold and even above life itself. According to the rumors, anyone who stained that honor would be thrown into beast cages as feed. His father stared at him in disbelief and demanded to know where he had heard such an absurd story. Slightly flustered, Aster answered that he had heard it somewhere long ago. Then, in a steadier tone, he declared that he was prepared for whatever awaited him, whether punishment or exile. After a brief silence, his father asked whether it truly did not bother him to leave without saying goodbye to Kudo. Aster smiled faintly and replied that it was fine since their departures had been scheduled around the same time anyway. He believed that because Kudo disliked him, she would probably feel more comfortable in his absence. He also admitted that thanks to her, he had finally begun understanding how to properly wield the sword Graham. He could now draw out the power of the 7 wings more freely than before. With steady eyes, he told his father not to come rescue him no matter what happened next, because he was prepared to survive on his own. His father opened his mouth, clearly intending to scold him for such reckless words. But before he could speak, a voice rang out from outside the carriage, questioning why Aster was acting so dramatic despite being the youngest among them. Aster's eyes widened in shock. Clinging to the side of the moving carriage was Kudo herself. Her sharp expression burned with stubborn determination as she glared directly at him. Without hesitation, she climbed into the moving carriage as though the journey ahead had always included her. The moment she stepped inside, she immediately turned toward Aster and demanded to know why he had slipped away without saying a single word to his older sister. Her voice carried both anger and disbelief. She added that she had heard about the summons from the elders of the main house, something that sounded less like an honor and more like a threat, especially since neither she nor Malfa had ever received such treatment before. Hyfryd immediately interrupted, firmly reminding her that she could not accompany them to the main house because the matter was too sensitive and dangerous. However, Kudo calmly sat beside Aster and explained that she already understood the situation. She knew their father had called both her and Malfa back from the Night Academy to guard the estate during his absence. She insisted that she was not foolish enough to overlook such an obvious implication. Still, her expression hardened as she warned that a summons from the main house meant the situation was extremely serious. Malfa herself had warned there was a real chance Aster might never return. Aster brushed the concern aside with a calm smile and claimed he was merely going there to talk before returning soon after. Yet deep down, he understood that his safe return was far from guaranteed. Suddenly, Kudo pointed directly at him and ordered him to listen carefully. Without softening her words, she openly admitted that she hated him. Aster blinked in surprise, but Kudo continued without hesitation. She hated that he was a man in a family where that alone granted advantages. She hated that he possessed 7 wings. She hated that he was constantly treated as someone special. She hated that he was stronger than his older sisters. She hated that despite being the youngest, he always carried himself with unnatural maturity. She hated every bit of it. Then her voice slowly softened. No matter how unfair those things felt to her, he was still family. No matter how strong or composed he acted, he was still her little brother. Rising proudly to her feet, she ordered him to return safely so they could properly settle their duel next time. This time, they would begin at full power from the very start. A faint smile curved across her lips, as she added that she would never allow him to escape with such a cheap victory. And with that, she leapt effortlessly from the moving carriage just as suddenly as she had appeared. Startled, Aster quickly leaned outside the carriage and questioned his father about why she had gone through all that trouble just to say those things. Hyfryd watched Kudo's shrinking figure with pride in his eyes and replied that it sounded like a proper farewell to him. A quiet smile appeared on Aster's lips. As he looked back once more, he saw Kudo standing boldly on the road behind them, watching the departing carriage without hesitation. Silently, he thanked her and made himself a firm promise that no matter what awaited him at the main house, he would return alive. Sometime later, Viscount Hyfryd and Aster finally arrived at the main residence of the Elmheim family. The moment they stepped onto the estate grounds, a team of guides moved to receive them. Their captain greeted them formally and announced that the Grand Elder was already waiting inside. Hearing this, Viscount Hyfryd calmly replied that there was no need for a guide because he already knew the way. However, the captain firmly refused and explained that they had been given strict orders to escort both of them personally. From the atmosphere alone, Aster immediately realized that they had not been summoned out of simple familial affection. The tension in the air felt stiff, deliberate, and oppressive. Even so, as Aster's gaze drifted across the familiar surroundings, a faint sense of nostalgia washed over him. He quietly reflected that it had been a long time since he had last returned home. His eyes lingered on the estate as old memories resurfaced, though he said nothing aloud. With no other choice, they proceeded deeper into the residence alongside the guides. As they walked, Viscount Hyfryd spoke in a low but serious tone, warning Aster not to lose his temper no matter what happened today. Aster listened before calmly replying that his actions would depend entirely on how the other side behaved. His father let out a slight sigh and explained that the other side itself was the real problem. He began warning Aster about the person they were about to meet, but before he could finish, Aster casually interrupted while still looking elsewhere. He remarked that Dallas was nowhere to be seen and guessed that returning anytime soon would be difficult after having his dominant hand crushed. Viscount Hyfryd shot him a sharp look and demanded to know whether he was even listening. Pulling himself back from his thoughts, Aster simply answered that he was. He then calmly added that he intended to remain as silent as a clam today, since Kudo had ordered him to return safely. By then, they had reached a massive door. It slowly creaked open, the heavy sound echoing throughout the corridor. As they stepped inside, the captain of the guards formally announced the arrival of Lord Hyfryd and his son. Seated at the far end of the grand hall, an elderly figure spoke in a measured voice, remarking that more than 10 years had already passed. Father and son moved forward together, while another amused voice quietly commented about Hyfryd's grandson. Viscount Hyfryd immediately dropped to his knees and bowed deeply in full respect, greeting the 6th head and great-grand elder after such a long absence. Aster, meanwhile, maintained his composure. As he felt the overwhelming weight of the elder's gaze upon him, he silently recognized the man before him as the true monster lurking within the shadows of Elmheim the 6th head, Zenith Elmheim. Around the elder sat the true heavyweights of the family, figures possessing immense authority and influence. Among them were several faces Aster recognized from the Sword Dance Festival. His eyes briefly swept across the hall before he casually asked whether Roderick was absent. A flicker of surprise crossed the room, but before anyone else could answer, the 6th head sharply replied that Roderick was not present because he served directly as the leader of the Royal Knights and had no time to involve himself in vulgar matters. Then, suddenly, a terrifying aura poured from the elder's body, pressing down upon the entire hall like an invisible force. His mere presence alone felt enough to dominate everyone in the room, as he coldly explained that since Roderick had no time for such vulgar matters, the old soldiers were handling the administrative duties instead. Aster remained outwardly calm, though his thoughts quietly moved beneath the surface. He reflected that in his previous life, he had never even been granted the opportunity to meet these people. Yet now, seeing so many executives gathered without the current head present, he realized just how overwhelming the 6th head's influence truly was, even in retirement. Finally, Count Hyfryd spoke in a controlled but firm voice and questioned what exactly these so-called vulgar matters were. Zenith Elmheim let out a low laugh before replying that Hyfryd had already guessed the answer. His sharp gaze shifted toward Aster as he remarked that Hyfryd's pet dog had caused quite a disturbance during the Sword Dance Festival. Viscount Hyfryd calmly responded that the current head, Roderick, had already resolved the matter and officially closed the case. However, the elder immediately dismissed that argument and coldly declared that the public resolution had merely been a performance. It does not change the fact that the Elmheim family's reputation had already been tarnished. The elder declared that adopting a child of unknown origin had been a mistake from the very beginning. He added that they would have ignored the matter if the boy had remained harmless. However, everything changed the moment he dared to bare his fangs at the main house. According to him, there was now no choice left but banishment. At that instant, an overwhelming killing intent flooded the hall, far more intense than before. The pressure became suffocating as it bore down on everyone mercilessly. The sixth head continued while keeping his gaze fixed forward, warning that even the Lord would not escape proper punishment. The threat was unmistakable. After hearing everything, Aster spoke firmly, insisting that he alone was responsible and that his father had nothing to do with the situation. At that moment, Viscount Hyfrid remained silent. He neither stopped his son nor defended him aloud. Seeing his father's silence, Aster gradually calmed himself and fell quiet as well. Zenith Elmheim observed the exchange with unreadable eyes before criticizing Aster for interrupting while adults were speaking. With that, the sixth head slowly rose from his seat, and the simple movement alone made the atmosphere inside the hall feel even heavier. He then declared that they commanded 12,000 knights under the name of Elmheim. However, he explained that the knights were far from united, as countless individuals constantly competed for the highest position. His gaze swept across the gathered elders and executives, making the meaning behind his words impossible to miss. Power within Elmheim was unstable and endlessly contested. In a hall filled with ambitious figures, even the smallest stain on their reputation could become a weapon. Zenith Elmheim stepped forward once again and calmly explained that all they wanted was peace of mind and proof that Aster would not become someone who could harm Elmheim. With a simple gesture, a sword was brought before Viscount Hyfrid. The blade radiated a violent aura, its energy spilling across the hall like an uncontrollable storm. The sixth head coldly reminded Viscount Hyfrid of the time he failed to protect his leech and dragged Elmheim's name through disgrace. He recalled that Roderick had personally severed that arm within the same hall. As another crushing wave of killing intent spread through the room, the pressure became nearly unbearable. The elder then mercilessly ordered Viscount Hyfrid to cut off Aster's head if he wished for the matter to end there. The words struck the hall like a blade. Without hesitation, Viscount Hyfrid firmly refused, declaring that he would rather take his own life than kill his own child. His voice carried no fear, only unwavering resolve. Hearing those words, Aster could only whisper his father's name before falling silent, unable to continue speaking. The sixth head remained standing as his oppressive presence flooded the room without mercy. His expression remained unchanged as he calmly declared that if that was the Viscount's answer, then he, his wife, his daughters, and even Aster should all die together. The hall sank into deathly silence as the threat lingered like an executioner's blade hanging overhead. The sixth head then announced that, starting from that very day, the Viscount house would be dissolved. The declaration felt like a final judgment. At once, numerous knights surged forward to carry out the order. Steel flashed throughout the hall as they surrounded Viscount Hyfrid with drawn swords, their killing intent fully unleashed. Seeing his father encircled from every direction, Aster stepped forward and questioned why the Grand Elder was so afraid. Zenith Elmheim narrowed his eyes in confusion, but Aster did not back down. Keeping his golden gaze steady, he mocked the elders by saying that if they were truly frightened of being bitten by a mere pet dog, then a group of grown adults trembling together like this was pathetic. The hall fell silent, stunned by his audacity. Aster continued by saying that they could banish or execute him if they wished, but if they intended to harm his family, things would be different. As he spoke, he began removing his shirt without hesitation. Viscount Hyfrid silently watched, fully aware of what his son intended to reveal. Before facing the elders once more, Aster softly apologized to his father, admitting that he was never very good at remaining silent. A nearby knight stared in shock before blurting out a question about the emblem on Aster's back. Aster stood tall, revealing the mark clearly for everyone to see. He then declared before the entire chamber that those 7 wings would one day become Elmheim's enemy and warned them to think carefully about their decision. The threat was no longer hidden. It had become direct, absolute, and impossible to ignore. Seeing this, one of the elders questioned in disbelief whether the emblem before them could truly be the 7 wings. Another elder immediately argued that such a thing had to be fake, explaining that in hundreds of years no human had ever manifested it. The heavyset elder, however, murmured that the crest was unmistakable. As the tension spread through the chamber, Zenith Elmheim stepped forward and demanded to know whether Aster truly understood the meaning behind what he was revealing to them. His words pressed heavily against everyone present. In response, Aster casually remarked that the answer should already be obvious. The greater the number of wings, the more shaken the nobles became. At that moment, the scene shifted toward the blue-haired man silently observing the chaos. Instead of panicking, he quietly laughed and urged them to continue. His amusement clashed sharply with the suffocating atmosphere surrounding the hall. Meanwhile, another noble nearby watched with visible unease, clearly disturbed by the revelation unfolding before them. Observing every reaction in the room, Zenith began explaining that the wing emblem was originally an organ used to generate magical power, a gift the spirits had once shared with humanity. Through generations, humans inherited and strengthened that power by passing it from parent to child. However, he declared that no one in history had ever reached the level of 7 wings. His statement sent another wave of shock across the chamber. Aster's expression tightened slightly as he questioned whether Zenith was implying that he belonged to the Spirit Clan. Zenith calmly answered that if the 7 wings were genuine, then such a possibility could indeed be real. The atmosphere immediately thickened. Nearby, Viscount Hyfrid remained silent while staring at his son in disbelief, the weight of the revelation clearly visible on his face. Yet Astor stepped forward without hesitation. He firmly declared that he was a child of the Viscount house and insisted that his birth no longer mattered. Inside his mind, Astor quietly recalled the old man's warning that Elmheim had never truly been united. Cracks already existed beneath the surface, and eventually those fractures would erupt into a massive civil war, capable of consuming the entire nation. He had already witnessed that future once before. For the survival of both himself and the Viscount house, he understood that remaining passive was no longer an option. At the very least, he needed to determine which nobles would become enemies and which could stand as allies. Even if risks were unavoidable, his resolve only hardened further. This situation was no longer simply about noble pride or the existence of 7 wings. It had become preparation for the inevitable disaster that only he knew was approaching. Hearing all of this, Zenith Elmheim responded with open anger and demanded whether Astor truly believed he possessed such overwhelming value. He further argued that there was still no proof confirming the 7 wings were genuine. His authority pressed heavily against the chamber as he attempted to crush the momentum Astor had created through intimidation and doubt. However, instead of retreating, Astor calmly smiled and stated that if they truly believed the 7 wings were fake, then they should simply kill him immediately. The room instantly fell silent. He then declared that such an action would turn the situation into a war between himself and everyone in that chamber. Despite his fearless expression, his thoughts moved carefully beneath the surface. He understood that killing him now would be easy, but he also knew Elmheim could not act recklessly while uncertainty surrounded the 7 wings. This was not reckless gambling. Every word had been deliberate bait. As the tension tightened further, the blue-haired noble suddenly rose from his seat and lightly clapped his hands as though entertained by the entire exchange. He remarked that the discussion was merely going in circles before proposing that they place Astor under a trial instead. At once, the heavy-set elder stiffened in protest and questioned what the Count was attempting to do. Yet the Count calmly interrupted him and explained that everyone present clearly wished to witness the power of the 7 wings for themselves. With a faint smile, the Count suggested that deciding Astor's fate could wait until after the trial had concluded. The atmosphere shifted again. What had started as an argument had now become something far more dangerous. A test capable of either proving Astor's claim or ensuring his destruction. The blue-haired noble smoothly continued by reminding everyone that the Marshall clan was renowned throughout the world, meaning preparing an appropriate trial should not be difficult. Hearing the title Count, Astor's thoughts immediately sharpened. He realized there was no mistake. This man was acting as an ally. The timing of the proposal and the direction of the conversation had provided him with a lifeline disguised as simple curiosity. After a long silence, Zenith Elmheim finally agreed and ordered everyone to follow him. Though his tone remained controlled, he stated that teaching manners to a disrespectful grandson was also the duty of an elder. With that, he turned and led the group away. Eventually, they arrived before a massive structure known as the trial grounds. Darkness surrounded the entrance as Zenith explained that beyond the underground bunker lay waterways, originally designed as an emergency evacuation shelter. However, he revealed that a single magic beast was currently being kept inside. After pausing briefly, he announced that the trial itself was simple. Astor only needed to defeat the beast. The simplicity of the challenge only made it feel heavier. Hearing this, Viscount Hyfrid released a deep sigh and admitted that Astor had always been a troublesome child who constantly cried and screamed in the past. He also lamented that he had repeatedly warned him to keep the existence of the 7 wings hidden. Though disappointment filled his words, worry was equally apparent. Astor listened in silence. Then, without speaking further, he stepped toward the massive door and slowly placed his hand against it. Astor calmly stated that this was the perfect opportunity as he pushed the massive door open. The heavy entrance creaked loudly while thick darkness spilled outward like cold smoke. Whatever waited inside was not merely a beast, it was proof. And without the slightest hesitation, Astor walked straight toward it. Hearing his son's determination, Viscount Hyfrid called out one final warning, urging him not to lower his guard. Astor immediately replied that he was leaving. Before descending further, he briefly glanced toward the blue-haired Count. The noble quietly smiled while observing everything with calm interest, and that faint expression lingered in Astor's mind as he stepped deeper underground. Darkness quickly surrounded him. The air felt damp and unbearably heavy while silence swallowed the bunker whole. Though the underground chamber was dark, it was not enough to completely blind him. Then he noticed it. A severed head resting on the ground. Even in the dim light, the identity was unmistakable. At that moment, a cold voice echoed from above, remarking that the man below had once been given a chance to clear his name, only to cry and scream until the very end. The words were directed toward the severed head lying before Astor. The voice continued with a faint warning, ordering Astor not to disappoint them as well. The meaning behind those words was obvious. This was not simply a test, it was judgment. Suddenly, the ground trembled violently as a massive presence emerged from the darkness. In front of Astor stood a gigantic beast overflowing with terrifying power. Its roar shook the entire underground chamber with enough force to make the walls tremble. Astor immediately tightened his grip around his sword as the blade faintly reflected the darkness surrounding him. Above the battlefield, the declaration came once again, as the nobles mercilessly announced the beginning of the trial. At the same time, Aster quietly recalled the rumors claiming that Elmheim kept a magic beast hidden beneath the mansion. For a brief moment, he even admitted that he almost felt sorry for Darius for being born into a family filled with monsters. As the beast continued roaring, Aster lowered his stance and calmly prepared himself. The instant his words ended, he suddenly burst forward with explosive speed. In a single flash, he dashed past the creature so quickly that his movement became almost impossible to follow. The moment he crossed the beast, its enormous body split apart instantly into countless pieces. Watching from above, every noble present froze in complete shock. After landing, Aster casually remarked that Sister Kudo was far scarier than the creature before him, while deliberately hiding his true thoughts. However, the situation immediately changed. Behind him, the scattered remains of the beast suddenly began moving. Piece by piece, its body slowly pulled itself back together until the monster completely regenerated before his eyes. The moment Aster realized what was happening, disbelief filled his expression. He muttered in shock that the creature was actually an undead monster. Moments later, the fully restored beast stood before him once again, as if nothing had happened at all. Without hesitation, it unleashed another deafening roar that shook the underground chamber. From above, Viscount Hyfryd shouted in panic after realizing that an undead creature had been hidden beneath the mansion. The scene then shifted toward Zenith Elmheim, who silently observed everything unfolding below. A dark smile slowly spread across his face as he calmly explained that undead creatures were naturally drawn toward the smell of death. According to him, the monster had wandered beneath the mansion searching for fresh corpses to devour. No matter how many times they cut or burned it, the creature simply refused to die. In the end, they had captured it and turned it into the perfect opponent for testing strength. Zenith then coldly added that thanks to the undead beast, disposing of corpses had become far easier for them. Hearing those words, the heavyset elder reacted in complete shock and argued that even skilled knights struggled to capture an undead creature, making it absurd to expect Aster to kill it. He further questioned whether Zenith truly intended to let the Seven Wings boy die for nothing. After hearing the elder's concern, Zenith only smiled more coldly and replied that if Aster died there, it would merely prove he was nothing more than a braggart. He further declared that a wing crest without true power was not even worthy of being called decoration. From above, the nobles continued silently watching the deadly situation unfold below them. Zenith then dismissively assured everyone not to worry, claiming that even Aster's death could still be useful to Elmheim. In fact, he admitted that such an outcome might even be more convenient for them. The moment those chilling words left his mouth, silence completely consumed the area. No one spoke as the ruthless meaning behind his statement settled heavily over the chamber. Amid the tension, the blue-haired count quietly watched everything while thinking to himself. After all the confidence Aster had shown earlier, the count silently hoped he would not die so easily. Soon afterward, attention returned to the fierce battle taking place below as violent waves of energy erupted from every clash between Aster and the undead beast. While continuing the fight, Aster carefully analyzed the situation in his mind and realized that no matter how many times he cut the creature, his attacks produced no lasting damage at all. Compared to ordinary undead monsters, its regeneration was completely abnormal. As he observed the beast's movements, he reminded himself that undead creatures were already dead to begin with. Despite the overwhelming difficulty, Aster remained standing firmly before the monster without retreating. While exchanging blows with the creature, he calmly recalled that undead could only be completely destroyed through sunlight, holy purification, or holy weapons. Otherwise, the standard tactic was simple: avoid fighting them entirely. However, he immediately rejected that option. Retreating was impossible here. Then, with determination burning stronger in his eyes, Aster concluded that relying on ordinary textbook strategies would make the existence of Seven Wings meaningless. Even against a nearly immortal enemy, he refused to step back. Instead, he prepared to carve out his own method of victory. Tightening his resolve, Aster declared that he needed to prove his worth no matter what. The creature moved so suddenly that even Aster failed to notice when it happened. In the blink of an eye, he found himself directly beneath the monster. Towering over him, the beast unleashed a deafening roar while its horrifying face loomed above him. Watching the terrifying scene from above, Viscount Hyfryd panicked and shouted Aster's name at the top of his lungs. Seeing the situation unfold, the blue-haired count suddenly stepped forward and urged Viscount Hyfryd not to ruin everything by interfering to save him. Hearing those words, Viscount Hyfryd turned toward him in fury and demanded whether they were truly expected to stand there and watch Aster die. The count calmly raised his hand to stop him, before telling him to calm down and take another look at the battlefield below. Keeping his eyes fixed on the fight, he remarked that Aster still seemed to have one final trump card remaining. After hearing this, everyone immediately shifted their attention back toward the battlefield. There they saw Aster standing in terrible condition after enduring the attack. Despite his injuries, he remained on his feet. Even more surprising, he was smiling. Looking at the results of the battle, Aster quietly noted that the technique appeared to be working properly, though slightly weaker than before. With those words, he slowly raised his sword and pointed it directly toward the monster before him. From his posture alone, everyone realized what he intended to do next. In the very next moment, an overwhelming surge of energy exploded outward from his sword and shot upward like a blazing pillar. The power was so immense that it instantly overwhelmed the undead beast standing before him. In a single strike, the terrifying creature was completely annihilated. As the destructive force erupted across the battlefield, Astor fiercely declared that the attack would continue until the monster finally died. Watching this overwhelming display, Viscount Hyfrid was left completely stunned as he recalled the technique he had once shown Astor in the past. Memories flashed through his mind while he stared at the raging energy below. However, after observing the attack more carefully, he realized it was not the same technique anymore. In disbelief, he corrected himself and concluded that Astor had transformed it into something entirely different. Meanwhile, the violent energy released by Astor's attack continued tearing across the battlefield. The pressure was so intense that even the elders standing above could clearly feel it. The entire underground structure began trembling under the overwhelming force. One elder suddenly shouted that the place was about to collapse, while another urgently ordered the elder lords to move away immediately. Panic quickly spread among the nobles as the destructive power threatened to bury everyone underground. Yet, amidst the chaos, one man remained completely calm. Zenith Elmheim silently observed everything before finally speaking in a composed voice. He quietly acknowledged that this was the true power of the Seven Wings. Nearby, the yellow-haired noble stared at the battlefield in complete shock. His eyes widened while he struggled to process what he had just witnessed. In disbelief, he demanded to know what had happened and questioned what became of the magic beast. Zenith Elmheim, who had carefully observed every detail, calmly analyzed the aftermath. He explained that Astor had dragged the undead creature into a vortex of magical power and torn it apart completely. His voice carried faint astonishment even as he spoke calmly. After saying this, Zenith fell silent for a brief moment while evaluating the battle in his mind. He concluded that Astor's attack had not even been a proper technique, but rather overwhelming brute force created purely from the immense quality and quantity of his magical power. Such power, in Zenith's view, was exactly what one would expect from someone possessing 7 wings. Turning toward Viscount Hyfrid, Zenith calmly asked whether this was something he had personally taught Astor. Hearing the question, Viscount Hyfrid admitted honestly that even he was shocked by how much his son had grown. Pride and surprise mixed together within his voice. Just then, the blue-haired count spoke once more. Looking toward Zenith respectfully, he asked whether the trial had finally been accepted. After hearing the question, Zenith glanced around the room. Seeing no objections from anyone present, he calmly announced that nobody there seemed to oppose the result anymore. Upon hearing the decision, the Count immediately looked down toward the battlefield and shouted for Astor to return because he had officially passed the trial. Astor's voice soon echoed back from below. However, he awkwardly explained that the chain he had used to descend earlier had been destroyed during the battle and requested that someone lower a rope instead. Afterward, the scene shifted toward a quiet room. Inside, Zenith Elmheim sat calmly with a composed expression, as though he had already made an important decision. Looking directly toward Astor, he remarked that opportunities like this only came once, and warned that there would not be a second chance if it was wasted. His words carried the feeling of a final turning point. Hearing this, Astor answered immediately without hesitation. He firmly stated that he had no interest in fighting over succession within the main family. He further explained that if someone like him remained near the mansion, his cousins would never feel at ease. According to Astor, his true place belonged within the Hyfrid house. His response sounded humble and straightforward, as though he had already accepted his role. Yet the moment Zenith heard those words, he suddenly laughed softly. The laugh carried amusement rather than mockery, as if he could clearly see through Astor's calm exterior. Smiling faintly, Zenith questioned whether Astor truly believed he could hide the ambition visible within his eyes. His gaze sharpened while studying the boy carefully. Then, with direct curiosity, he asked whether Astor planned to one day point his sword toward Elmheim itself, and whether his ultimate goal was Duke Roderick's head. Hearing such a blunt question, Astor looked momentarily confused. The accusation had come so suddenly that he struggled to answer immediately. Seeing his reaction, Zenith laughed again before casually dismissing the tension. He reassured Astor that there was no need to become defensive because he had no interest in prying into his thoughts yet. After listening silently, Astor finally spoke again and asked why the rebels were not considered enemies of Elmheim. Hearing the question, Zenith's expression became far more serious. The amusement disappeared from his face as he calmly reminded Astor that Elmheim had never been completely united. He explained that Roderick's personality was far too dominant, and if Astor's existence could act as a restraining force against him, then that outcome was acceptable. The atmosphere in the room immediately became tense as Zenith's gaze sharpened further. Finally, he warned Astor that if he ever turned his fangs toward Elmheim itself, he already understood what the consequences would be. The warning was not loud, but the weight behind it made its meaning impossible to misunderstand. Hearing this, Astor remained silent while a very different thought quietly formed inside his mind. "You damn old monster of Elmheim," he thought bitterly. Just then, the door of the room opened and Viscount stepped inside. Looking toward Astor, he asked directly whether the discussion had finished and what had been said. Astor turned toward him and calmly explained that Earl Mays had offered to bring him into the main family, but he had refused. Upon hearing this, Viscount Hyfrid's eyes widened in shock and he exclaimed in disbelief, unable to comprehend the refusal. At that moment, another voice spoke nearby, remarking that it was a waste, since joining the main family would have brought far greater benefits. The speaker was the blue-haired Earl Mays. Astor studied him carefully before asking if he was indeed Earl Mays and why he had earlier made a proposal that seemed to favor him. The Earl responded casually that he was simply annoyed at an arrogant brat. He then stepped closer and placed a hand on Aster's shoulder, stating that from that moment on, Aster had become in name and reality a bearer of the 7 wings. He gestured around and told him to look. As Aster observed the surroundings, he noticed the silent but intense reactions of those present. Some stared at him with fascination and greed, while others calculated silently. Many among them privately thought that the power of the 7 wings should belong to them, while others decided that if he became an obstacle, he should be removed despite his age. The air around Aster quietly filled with hidden ambition, suspicion, and schemes. We see Aster standing motionless, while an overwhelming amount of energy continued pouring out from his body. Every weapon aimed at him was completely deflected, unable to come close because of the immense force surrounding him. Witnessing this, one of the nearby participants stared in shock and questioned what kind of monster Aster was, since not even arrows could approach him. Even the examiner observing from above looked stunned. In disbelief, he wondered if Aster was spinning his released magic to create air currents through pure magical control. At the same time, Aster quietly reflected within his mind. He felt as though he was completely surrounded by a storm. The pressure radiating from him was so intense that the people nearby struggled just to withstand its presence. After a moment, someone cautiously asked whether everything had finally ended. From above, the examiner calmly observed the aftermath before announcing that more participants had survived than expected, though it ultimately did not matter. He then congratulated everyone who remained standing and instructed them to look around at the corpses scattered across the field, because those still alive had passed the first test. Without wasting time, he immediately ordered everyone to follow him to the next testing area. The participants listened carefully as the weight of the brutal trial slowly sank in. Meanwhile, Smites, still shaken after witnessing everything, looked at Aster with a mixture of fear and awe. He remarked that the instructors were terrifying for attacking them with a non-stop rain of arrows. Aster simply smiled casually and asked if Smites was already exhausted. Confused and slightly shaken, Smites turned back toward him and questioned why Aster did not look tired at all. Everything happening below was being carefully observed by the examiner from above. As he watched Aster closely, he thought in amazement that despite releasing an enormous amount of magic, Aster showed absolutely no signs of fatigue. In his mind, the examiner then ordered the 7-winged Elmheim to prove his courage in the next test. Not far away, Gurion also continued watching Aster carefully. While staring at him, an old memory resurfaced in his mind. Someone had once spoken to him firmly and warned him that he had to prevent Aster from becoming a kingdom knight at all costs, for the future of the Elmheim family. Remembering those words caused Gurion's expression to darken as anger quietly rose within him. Soon after, the scene shifted outside as everyone gathered for the next stage of the examination. An inspector stepped forward and announced that to ensure fairness in the next trial, everyone would be required to use identical swords and surrender their personal weapons beforehand. Hearing this, one participant immediately complained that the rule was troublesome. Aster, who had been quietly listening, slightly turned and asked whether the rules had been different in previous exams. Smites responded by explaining that ordinary middle-class knights usually carried similar swords anyway, though Aster's weapon was unusually remarkable. Several nearby knights overheard the conversation as Aster glanced down at his sword and calmly acknowledged what Smites had said. At that moment, Gurion approached them with a smug expression and sarcastically remarked that Aster seemed to have already tamed servants around him. Aster completely ignored him, refusing to even acknowledge his presence. Meanwhile, Smites became visibly irritated and immediately questioned who Gurion was calling a servant. Gurion looked at him with open disdain before mocking him as nothing more than the heir of a low-ranking baron family from an insignificant village. He further warned Smites that following the wrong person could ruin his future. Despite the insult, Smites instantly changed his tone and nervously claimed that he had nothing to do with Aster at all. Aster silently observed the entire exchange from behind them without saying a single word. Shortly afterward, Gurion turned around and left with his group while Smites quickly followed behind him. On the other side, the examiner raised his voice and loudly announced that he would now explain the second trial. His commanding presence immediately drew everyone's attention. He then explained that the second trial would be a mock battle focused on attack and defense inside a forest. The participants would be divided into 3 teams and would compete to capture bases by raising their team's flag on the enemy flagpole. He further declared that the team managing to capture at least 2 bases before sunset would be declared victorious. After pausing briefly, he added that destroying, stealing, or disabling flags was strictly forbidden, though aside from that, there were no restrictions. In a colder tone, he then informed everyone that the swords they had been given could be treated as permission to kill if necessary. Once the rules had been fully explained, he stepped forward and began announcing the teams for the trial. Gurion was assigned as the leader of the first team. The white-haired participant from the previous test became the leader of the second, while Aster led the third group. Each of them stood before their respective teams, prepared for the upcoming battle. As everything settled, Aster calmly analyzed the situation and explained that the battle would begin once the smoke signal was raised. He further noted that there were 3 flags, 1 for each faction, and victory required capturing at least 2 bases, including their own. His voice echoed slightly, drawing the attention of those nearby. A few people in the crowd began whispering among themselves. One man muttered that Smites was bullying the new guy again. Another person beside him sighed and remarked that Smites never got tired of doing this every year. Then his expression shifted when he looked more closely at Aster. More importantly, he realized that the person being targeted was the Elmheim mentioned in the rumors. A third voice joined in with quiet awe and asked if he was from the Seven Wings. Hearing this, Bigger Smites' expression stiffened. In his mind, the words echoed repeatedly, Seven Wings. Before he could react further, someone else stepped forward. His tone was light yet carried a strange familiarity. The newcomer smiled faintly and said that he had been wondering who the person was and was surprised to see Cousin Aster. At those words, Aster's calm expression finally shifted. He turned his gaze sharply toward the speaker, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized him. Seeing Aster, his cousin Gurion smiled faintly and stepped closer. He casually explained that since nobody knew when or where Aster had been born, he had decided to call him cousin. Aster listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Then without hesitation he commented that it was unfortunate what happened to Dallas. For a brief moment, silence filled the air, but Gurion's smile only sharpened. Gurion lightly replied that Dallas had been a disgrace who deserved to die. He further admitted that he actually felt relieved after Dallas was gone, because Dallas had always acted bossy, simply for being older. Gurion added that Dallas had also been a nuisance to him. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked directly at Aster. The friendliness in his voice disappeared as he warned Aster not to underestimate the people of the main house, regardless of whether he belonged to the Seven Wings or not. With that, Gurion turned around and began walking away. Before leaving completely, he glanced over his shoulder and warned Aster that nobody was left to protect him there anymore. The tension lingered heavily in the air even after he disappeared. Nearby, one of the onlookers exhaled in disbelief and remarked that the two Elmheim examinees this term had terrible luck. Another man beside him muttered that the main house and the branch house were apparently still fighting each other. A third person quickly added that he did not want to get involved in their conflict. Meanwhile, Smites, who had been loud and arrogant moments earlier, now looked completely shaken. His confidence crumbled as realization dawned on him. He stared at Aster in disbelief and questioned if he was truly part of the Elmheim family. Aster simply gave a calm smile as though none of it mattered to him, and politely told him that calling him Aster was enough. Soon the scene shifted to the first exam venue. A large gathering of candidates stood assembled while the atmosphere remained heavy with anticipation. At the front, an examiner stepped forward, his voice loud and authoritative as it echoed across the area. He congratulated everyone for making it that far and praised their courage and patriotism. He then explained that Kingdom Knights were different from ordinary provincial knights scattered throughout the countryside. After pausing briefly, he proudly declared that they existed to serve and protect the king. The examiner's voice rose even louder as he passionately described the Kingdom Knights as glorious swords willing to risk their lives for the king. He further stated that they had no need for dull or blunt swords and instructed everyone to treat the exam like a battlefield. As those powerful words echoed across the venue, Aster watched silently. In his mind, Aster thought that the examiner's speech sounded ridiculous, yet his gaze remained steady as quiet determination formed within him. He realized that he had finally returned to the path of becoming a Kingdom Knight, a right that had once been denied to him when he was wingless. Memories briefly passed through his mind of the time when he could only stand outside that path without being able to move forward. But now, everything was different. Beyond this place existed a world of true strength, a world he could never reach before. His eyes sharpened as one particular figure appeared in his thoughts, the man still standing at the very top, Kingdom Knight General Commander Roderick Elmheim. A faint but confident resolve formed within him as he vowed that he would soon catch up to Roderick. His thoughts became firm and focused as he reminded himself that passing the selection exam came first. Just then, the examiner's voice cut through the air again, pulling everyone back to reality. He announced that the first exam was about to begin. Before he could properly finish speaking, a sharp whistling sound sliced through the air. In the very next instant, an arrow pierced one of the candidates directly in the head, causing the man to collapse immediately. For a split second, silence fell over the area before chaos erupted throughout the crowd. Then a cold voice resounded once again. The examiner announced that the first trial was the Arrow Tower exam, and declared that the last person standing would be the winner. Panic and confusion instantly spread among the candidates. Some looked around frantically, trying to understand the situation. One candidate shouted in disbelief and fear as he asked what they were supposed to do against something like this. Another candidate yelled loudly, panic obvious in his voice, and warned everyone that they would die if they stayed still. He quickly ordered them to group together, watch each other's backs, and block the incoming arrows. His words snapped many people out of their shock, causing several candidates to move together, while desperately raising their weapons to defend themselves from the relentless rain of arrows. Chaos spread throughout the field as people scrambled to survive, forming small groups and attempting to shield one another from the deadly assault pouring down from above. High above the battlefield, the examiner calmly observed everything with a calculating gaze. There was no urgency in his expression, only quiet observation. He calmly remarked that veterans from previous exams already understood what to do. After briefly scanning the struggling candidates below, he further explained that even with those methods, the survival rate remained only around 30%. He added that such shallow countermeasures would eventually reach their limit. Almost as if to prove his point, another candidate was struck by an arrow and collapsed instantly, increasing the fear and tension among the remaining participants. The examiner continued speaking in an indifferent tone as he explained that what they truly wanted to see was overwhelming problem-solving ability, something only those with a wing could achieve. At that moment, the focus shifted toward a white-haired individual. Unlike everyone else, he moved effortlessly, deflecting incoming arrows with smooth and precise movements, as though the attacks posed no threat to him at all. His actions were sharp and flawless, drawing attention even amidst the chaos. Watching this, the examiner narrowed his eyes with clear interest. Meanwhile, in complete contrast to the panic around him, Astor remained standing perfectly still, unmoving as though the storm of arrows did not concern him in the slightest. Noticing this, one nearby candidate stared at him in disbelief and questioned why Astor was simply standing there, wondering if fear had caused him to freeze. Seeing the scene, Gurion secretly smirked and hoped that Astor would die after being pierced by countless arrows. But in the very next moment, everything changed. Astor calmly drew the small sword that everyone had mocked earlier. The instant the blade left its sheath, an overwhelming energy burst out from him. The force was so powerful that the arrows flying toward him never even reached his body. They were destroyed mid-air as if erased by his presence alone. Everyone nearby froze in complete shock, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. One person stared in disbelief and shouted that Astor had deflected every single arrow. Astor stood calmly with a faint smile on his face and challenged them to send every arrow toward him. The blue-haired earl then spoke again, explaining that the emblem of the 7 wings carried immense value, and that many would soon attempt to recruit him. Astor asked directly whether the earl was one of those people. The earl appeared briefly surprised before answering that he was a member of the Knights Academy board. Astor observed him and concluded internally that the man was unusual, and not yet someone he could trust as an ally. Viscount Hyford then approached and placed a hand on Astor's shoulder, telling him it was time to leave, and that he should inform his sisters about the day's events. Astor agreed and replied respectfully, though he added that his mother would likely faint if she saw his injuries. The scene shifted to another noble residence where a knight delivered a report about a young noble who had died during Sir Zenith's test. Duke Roderick responded calmly, showing little reaction. He also asked about Hyford's son being summoned by the main family elders. The knight hesitated, silently questioning whether the Duke truly cared about his son, but he maintained professionalism and prepared to answer. Before he could continue fully, Roderick already correctly inferred that the boy possessed the 7 wings. Roderick leaned back and stated that if the situation continued, Elmheim's balance of power could collapse. When asked whether action should be taken, he dismissed the concern, stating that if Elmheim could not handle such matters, it would have fallen long ago. He then added with quiet confidence that the wings would eventually belong to him. His expression darkened slightly as he decided to observe the boy for now and see how long he would endure. Years later, the Knights Academy entrance examination was underway in a crowded field. Candidates lined up while officials guided them through registration. A soldier commented on a familiar-looking figure, but his companion dismissed it, saying it could not be him. At the desk, an official stated that the kingdom would not be responsible for injuries during the exam, and instructed candidates to present their wing emblems. When Astor stepped forward, the official hesitated upon seeing him and stumbled over his words. Astor then asked calmly whether he should present the emblem, adding that it was inconvenient to display, and jokingly asking if his face would be enough instead. The relaxed confidence in his expression caused confusion among the staff. Later, at the Grand Hall, Astor walked forward as murmurs followed him. A man named Smites mocked him, questioning his identity, and stating that he did not belong in a place reserved for elite knights. He dismissed Astor's weapon as childish and told him to leave if he was only there to observe. However, Astor remained unfazed and simply responded that there was no problem, causing Smites to hesitate as the surrounding crowd reacted in anticipation. At that moment, Astor began questioning whether they had been given a defective sword for the exam. The thought lingered in his mind as he tried to understand what had just happened. Meanwhile, Nolan had not finished attacking yet. He continued pushing forward aggressively and declared that there was no reason to worry because their battle would remain a gentleman's duel from beginning to end. He also stated that he disliked the people of Elmheim, especially those who tried to stand out like Astor, calling them centennials with clear disdain. By then, Nolan had already shattered Astor's sword brutally and continued attacking without giving him any chance to recover. Astor struggled under the overwhelming pressure surrounding him. However, he quickly regained his composure. He grabbed the broken piece of his sword and channeled his energy into it before unleashing a sudden strike toward Nolan. The attack shot forward with tremendous force, catching Nolan slightly off guard. Nolan managed to block it, but only with difficulty. During that brief distraction, he noticed something unexpected. Astor had already turned around and started running away. Surprised by the sudden move, Nolan shouted and questioned whether Astor was truly running away while telling him to stop. Astor, however, did not slow down. While moving away, he turned back slightly and explained that their fight would happen later because he still had another score to settle with his cousin. His calm response made it clear that he was acting with intention rather than fear. Hearing this, Nolan smiled mockingly and questioned whether Astor had become frightened, adding that he no longer deserved to be called a gentleman. Afterward, Nolan picked up the broken sword from the ground and examined it carefully. He questioned what kind of sword it was and remarked that even for a cheap weapon, it lacked far too much quality. It became obvious to him that something about the sword was abnormal. Nolan paused briefly and ran his hand through his hair as if he had finally realized the truth. He quietly concluded that this entire situation was Elmheim's doing, and remarked that it was an unpleasant way to ruin the atmosphere. On the other side, Aster returned to his territory and immediately called out, asking if Smite was all right. Before he could receive an answer, a familiar voice reached him. The voice remarked that Aster had arrived sooner than expected. Standing there was none other than Grion, the person behind the entire scheme. Everything happening inside the exam had been carefully orchestrated by him from the very beginning. Grion calmly continued, and stated that Nolan had apparently failed to stop Aster. Around them, everyone was already prepared for battle and ready to attack at any moment. Grion then reminded Aster of his earlier claim that he alone would be enough, adding that he had expected much more from him. He casually asked how things were going on Aster's side before revealing that they had already secured the third base. As Aster looked around, he clearly saw the red flag raised over the base, marking it as Nolan's territory. Grion then declared that this was only the beginning, and that complete conquest would come next. Hearing all of this filled Aster with anger and frustration. He immediately demanded to know what had happened to his classmates. Grion's expression darkened slightly after hearing him, and he prepared to answer. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. A person appeared behind Grion and pointed a sword directly at him. That person was Smites, who nervously told Aster not to misunderstand the situation. At that moment, it became clear that betrayal had already spread through Aster's own team. Smites continued explaining that from the very beginning, he had already informed Grion that he would not cooperate with the plan. His words revealed that not everyone had willingly participated in the scheme, even though the damage had already been done. Smites still sounded uncertain as he spoke. He claimed that those who opposed Elmheim were cowards, yet his voice lacked conviction, as though he could not fully believe his own words. Grion then stepped forward and confidently stated that Aster's allies had not even attempted to resist. He continued by insulting them as nothing more than field monkeys, and added that they at least had enough sense to understand which side of Elmheim they should support. Hearing those words made Aster furious. He directly challenged Grion and questioned whether he truly believed that gathering more people would be enough to defeat him. Grion simply smiled and calmly responded that Aster was mistaken because the battle had already been decided. He then explained the true victory condition of the attack and defense battle, saying that the team controlling 2 or more bases by the end of the exam would win. Even if Aster fell into despair and raised flags at every base, he still would not have enough people to defend them all. As Aster looked around, he noticed that the blue flag had already been destroyed, making the situation even worse. Grion revealed even more of his strategy, explaining that all they needed to do was wait for Aster to move elsewhere before raising the red flag again. Grion's smile widened as he explained how simple and effective the strategy was. However, instead of backing down, Aster firmly declared that he would prevent them from accomplishing even that much. The tension between them intensified immediately. Aster's determination became obvious as he announced that he would continue fighting until everyone was torn apart. Hearing those words caused everyone nearby to tremble in fear. Grion, however, only smiled and dismissed Aster's statement as nonsense. He pointed at Aster's sword and remarked that the weapon was completely useless. He added that even if Aster possessed 7 wings, without a noble sword, he was nothing more than worthless. Grion continued revealing how carefully every part of the plan had been arranged before challenging Aster and asking whether he truly intended to fight everyone present. After hearing that, Aster calmly admitted that the situation was troublesome and acknowledged that Grion had exceeded his expectations. He drew his sword once again, but the broken blade remained visible, causing uneasiness among the people watching. Aster then stated that Grion had planned everything far more thoroughly than expected, before suddenly dropping the sword to the ground. Seeing this, Grion immediately declared that their victory had already been secured. However, the moment the sword touched the ground, Aster prepared himself again. The determination burning in his eyes made it obvious that he had no intention of giving up. After everything that had happened, Aster suddenly announced that he gave up, and admitted that he was impressed by Grion's planning. Hearing this made Grion feel deeply satisfied, but the instant Aster's sword slipped downward, he released a violent surge of energy while bending slightly. In a single instant, Aster struck backward with incredible force and sent Smites flying into the distance. The impact was powerful enough to knock Smite's sword out of his hand. Taking advantage of the opening, Aster grabbed the fallen weapon and unleashed a devastating attack both in front of him and behind him. Everyone nearby collapsed from that single overwhelming strike. Watching everything unfold from above, Grion could only shout in complete shock. Aster then pointed his sword directly at him and declared that despite Grion's planning, he had still made the mistake of standing in front of him and interfering. He then warned that Grion was about to lose. At that moment, Aster was seen standing in a remarkably composed stance. Witnessing this, Grion growled as he called Aster a damn monster. Meanwhile, an enormous surge of energy began converging around Aster's feet, building rapidly. In an instant, Aster moved and closed the distance in a single burst of speed. Although he was already in mid-air, he rushed toward Grion at an unbelievable velocity, preparing to strike without hesitation. Grion, startled, looked back in disbelief and questioned whether Aster had actually flown all the way there. Aster then declared that Grion was too slow and would not be able to escape anymore. In the next moment, Aster launched a direct and overwhelming attack. Grion attempted to block it with his sword, but the impact was far beyond his expectations, and his blade shattered instantly upon contact. At that moment, Aster reflected inwardly, recalling the first time he had flown, and realizing that it was not inability before, but a new sense of awareness of manipulating magic and closing distance freely. Aster approached Grion and remarked that having wings was useful, even referencing how large the wall had seemed before. Grion attempted to respond, but Aster interrupted him and dragged him downward while continuing his words. He added that despite the scale of things, they felt small to him now, a faint smile forming on his face. In the very next instant, both of them crashed violently into the ground, triggering a massive explosion that shook the entire area. Those watching were left in complete shock. Smites muttered in disbelief, questioning what kind of fight had just occurred and what had become of the two combatants. The surrounding observers were equally stunned, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Through the thick dust, a figure could be seen dragging another across the ground, gradually revealing it to be Aster as the dust settled. He had completely defeated Grion, who no longer resisted and appeared to have given up entirely. Aster threw him down and stated that it hurt before turning to the others in irritation and questioning what they were all doing just standing there. He then issued an order for them to eliminate Grion under the authority of the Elmheim family. Smites immediately rushed toward his fallen sword, while Aster calmly questioned whether he was afraid of Elmheim's retaliation. Smites, filled with anger and fear, explained that his family was only a third-rate noble house that could be destroyed at any moment if Elmheim chose to act against them. He added that weaker noble families had no choice but to act submissively in order to survive, no matter how cowardly it seemed. Raising his voice in frustration, he argued that someone born with privilege could never understand their situation. Hearing this, Aster simply smiled, which only intensified Smite's anger as he demanded to know what Aster was laughing at. Aster then responded calmly, referencing his sister's similar words about privilege and acknowledging that while he had advantages, it also meant he had responsibilities only he could fulfill. Meanwhile, Grion lay beneath his sword, watching everything with rising fury as Aster boldly declared that Elmheim was his enemy and that he intended to tear it down and rebuild it completely. This declaration left everyone in stunned silence, shaken by the weight of his intention. Grion, still on the ground, questioned what Aster was even talking about, while Smites asked if he truly understood the meaning of such a declaration. Aster, without hesitation, confirmed that it was a declaration of war. He stated that blind loyalty to the current Elmheim would ultimately lead to betrayal and death, and that only by fighting could they avoid that fate. He then referenced the 7 wings he carried as the power meant for this purpose and demanded that they choose which side to follow. Grion, furious, warned that such betrayal would not be forgiven, and that he remembered every face and name present. Hearing this, Smites fell into panic, overwhelmed by uncertainty about his choice and the fate of his family. After a moment of internal struggle, he threw down his sword and stepped forward, demanding assurance that Aster would truly defeat Grion. He then raised a blue flag and pledged his support to Aster Elmheim, formally declaring his allegiance. The declaration caused shock among the onlookers, who could hardly believe what they had just heard, realizing the battle had shifted dramatically. Grion's anger intensified as he cursed Aster in fury, while Smites encouraged others to rise and resist the arrogant Elmheim faction, calling for them to fight under the 7 wings. However, the others remained uncertain, hesitating as confusion outweighed motivation. Aster observed this and internally concluded that one ally had been secured, but more were still needed to challenge Elmheim. Nearby, Grion, still enraged, rejected concern from someone attempting to approach him and insulted them harshly. His thoughts burned with determination as he refused to allow this rebellion to continue and began attempting to activate the power of his 4 wings. The atmosphere grew tense until a voice suddenly interrupted from behind, casually yet sharply addressing Elmheim's condition and calling him pathetic. Grion turned and recognized Nolan, who had finally arrived. As Grion explained the situation, Nolan's presence signaled a new shift in the confrontation, while Grion's expression darkened with a calculating thought that he still had support on his side. Grion believed that although Christopher's wing badge did not match the 7 wings, his swordsmanship still surpassed everyone present. That thought restored Grion's confidence. He raised his voice with authority and ordered his subordinates to quickly cut the target down. However, in the next instant, an unexpected event occurred, something no one had anticipated. Christopher suddenly stepped forward and struck Grion in the face with a red flag. He then calmly stated that he had returned the flag and declared that their alliance was being broken because their methods conflicted with his sense of chivalry. The impact of those words left Grion stunned and disoriented on the ground, unable to comprehend the sudden betrayal. Around him, shocked murmurs spread rapidly as members questioned the situation, with one person in disbelief saying that even the Nolan family had betrayed them, while another anxiously admitted that they no longer knew which side to support. The situation quickly descended into chaos as alliances collapsed and trust completely disintegrated among the participants. Amid the confusion, Nolan calmly drew his sword, the sharp sound of the blade cutting through the tension in the air. He stated with steady confidence that they had returned to the starting point and reminded Aster that he should not have expected to complete the exam without resolving their conflict. Nolan then declared that only one team would be allowed to pass, and emphasized that if both sides aimed to become Kingdom Knights, they would have no choice but to settle the matter there. Christopher also stepped forward, affirming the pride of the Nolan family's swordsmanship against the Seven Wings as he took a firm stance. The atmosphere tightened as both sides faced each other, their focus locked. Without hesitation, Nolan initiated the attack, charging forward at incredible speed and unleashing a powerful strike, while declaring that he intended to prove superiority once and for all. Nolan's attack carried overwhelming force, shaking the surrounding air. Upon witnessing this, Astor's energy surged instinctively as he prepared to respond. He firmly rejected the idea of waiting and immediately moved to intercept Nolan's strike. Although he engaged in combat, it was evident that Astor was not fighting at his full strength, as the ordinary sword in his hand limited his ability to fully release the power of the Seven Wings. Nolan quickly noticed the difference during their exchange and realized Astor's style had changed significantly. As their blades clashed, Nolan's weapon was forced downward, leaving a deep mark on it from Astor's strike. Nolan retreated swiftly to create distance and stated that only one team could pass the exam, reiterating that their goals placed them in direct opposition. Astor responded calmly that this would be a problem, then unexpectedly expressed that he also wanted Nolan to become a Kingdom Knight. This statement surprised Nolan, who questioned it in disbelief. Astor explained steadily that Nolan had already inspired others to rise against Elmheim, and therefore it would be unreasonable to ask him to abandon his dreams simply because they stood on opposing sides. He then revealed that he had a plan to ensure everyone could pass the exam. This declaration shocked not only Nolan but also Grun, while the surrounding group reacted with disbelief. One member voiced that such a result seemed impossible, and Grian himself struggled to accept it. Despite the skepticism, Astor lowered his sword slightly and admitted that while he could not guarantee success, he was confident if everyone cooperated. He then approached Grian directly, causing Grian to tense up due to lingering fear from earlier events. However, instead of attacking, Astor extended his hand and calmly suggested that they reconcile first. This unexpected gesture shifted the atmosphere, making the battlefield feel uncertain as hostility began to fade. The scene then changed as all flags were found gathered and tied into a single long formation across the camps, creating an unusual sight for the exam setting. Upon arrival, the examiner immediately expressed anger and questioned the meaning of the arrangement, criticizing their understanding of the rules. Astor calmly explained that the victory condition required occupying multiple camps, and that no rule specified only one team per flag, leading them to form a three-team alliance to occupy all camps together. The examiner rejected the explanation, accusing them of mocking the exam and demanding clarification. Nearby participants expressed doubt, believing the plan would fail. The examiner then challenged Astor directly, questioning whether he would simply cooperate with an enemy if ordered to attack a territory. Astor responded that if the enemy had greater value alive than dead, that choice would still be valid. The examiner harshly rejected this reasoning, stating that knights serve the state and cannot make such judgments. Astor, however, questioned whether disqualifying them would simply be an overreach of authority, intensifying the confrontation. For a moment, even the examiner appeared caught off guard, unable to respond immediately. Astor did not stop there. He stepped slightly closer and added in a quieter, more deliberate tone, that if everyone were to fail in such a manner, he wondered whether the main family would truly remain silent about it. That statement immediately shifted the atmosphere. The tension in the air changed, and the examiner's reaction shifted from pure anger to hesitation. Soon after, the entire scene transitioned to another area where everyone was gathered and waiting. Smite sat in front of Astor, visibly restless, and asked if they were truly going to be fine after the examiner had gone to consult his superiors, and they had been left on standby for an hour. He expressed concern that they might all end up failing. Astor remained unusually calm and responded lightly that he did not know, but at the very least they had shown something worth considering. Nearby, the others remained grouped around Grian, still uncertain about everything that had occurred. Smite lowered his voice and commented that he was surprised the so-called noble heir had agreed to cooperate, asking what Astor had said to him. Astor simply brushed it off, saying it was nothing much. At that moment, a loud voice cut through the area, immediately drawing everyone's attention forward. The examiner stood before them with a commanding presence and announced that Principal Mimur would now reveal the exam results, instructing everyone to listen carefully. Smite squinted at the figure who stepped forward and muttered in surprise whether that was the director. Noting that he looked like an ordinary old man, Astor immediately corrected him, saying that was rude. The principal then looked directly at Astor and calmly stated that, thanks to him, they had been forced into a difficult decision, explaining that handling such a large number of candidates at once was unprecedented, and that although repeating the exam had been considered, they had ultimately decided to accept Astor's argument with the support of the other principals. Astor's eyes widened slightly as he asked if that meant what he thought it meant. The principal smiled faintly and confirmed that all of them had passed, encouraging them to continue striving and prove that the decision was not a mistake. For a brief moment, silence filled the area before it erupted into celebration, with cheers and laughter spreading among the candidates. The principal congratulated them on their admission and welcomed them to the Knights Academy. Smite appeared overwhelmed with joy, unable to contain his excitement. Later, the scene shifted to the new students gathered in a resting area, where some were bathing while others relaxed after the exhausting exam. Smite loudly expressed his amazement at the food and facilities, crediting Astor for everything. As attention turned toward him, Astor remained silent, Meanwhile, others expressed disbelief at having passed, with one even declaring loyalty to Nolan. Smite teased Nolan, pointing out that the one who had lost to Aster was acting important. Nolan immediately corrected him, insisting that it had been a draw. Aster then spoke calmly, stating that regardless of interpretations, they had still challenged the people of Elmheim and managed to become candidates through that process. He paused briefly as everyone turned toward him, then continued with quiet intensity that what they had begun would eventually become a force strong enough to bring down Elmheim. He then declared that their rebellion had officially begun. Internally, he reflected on his sisters, noting that one of them, Alphen, who had entered earlier, likely already understood the Academy's inner structure and could become an ally. He then considered that starting the next day, formal training would begin and that he needed to adapt to life there. With that thought, he turned to leave. As he walked away, he noticed Smite and several nobles staring at him with strange expressions. When he asked what they were doing, Smite enthusiastically explained that seeing one of the 7 wings brought good fortune and suggested they were trying to receive blessings. They suddenly knelt in front of him in an almost worshipful manner, leaving Aster visibly uncomfortable as he firmly rejected the idea. Meanwhile, Nolan observed everything silently from a distance with an unreadable expression. The scene then shifted to an unknown location where a cold voice echoed through the room, expressing disappointment in Gryan and criticizing his failure to crush the 7 wings. The speaker, Helen Elmheim, appeared with a sharp and furious gaze, accusing him of standing by while being insulted. Gryan begged for forgiveness, but she struck him violently, declaring there would be no second chance and humiliating him further. Another figure, Liliane Elmheim, then stepped forward and continued the abuse, showing complete contempt. Gryan was beaten down further, trembling as he begged for mercy while being compared to a failure like Dalus. Overwhelmed by pain and humiliation, his thoughts twisted into hatred toward Aster, blaming him for everything. The narrative then revealed a flashback showing the true reason Gryan had aligned with Aster. In the memory, Aster calmly approached him and proposed cooperation, stating that Gryan could not return empty-handed. Confused, Gryan asked what he meant, and Aster explained that being defeated by the so-called scum of the Lena family branch and failing the exam would put him in a dangerous position. Aster's words carried a quiet threat as he warned Gryan to consider what would happen if he brought that report to the great elder of the main house. He further implied that such a failure could cost him his life, citing the tragic fate of Dalus as an example. The warning left Gryan completely shaken, filling him with fear. Aster warned Griot that he would not want to end up suffering the same fate as Dalus. Those words caused Grion's body to stiffen as terrifying images filled his mind. Aster stepped closer and calmly explained that Grion only needed to remain silent and ignore whatever actions he took. In return, Aster promised to help him. At that moment, Grion realized he no longer had the option to refuse. The scene then returned to the present, where another voice suddenly spoke in a calm yet amused tone, asking Liliane to forgive her brother since he was already crying and apologizing. Grion remained collapsed on the ground, trembling helplessly as he weakly addressed the newcomer as brother. Standing before him was Julius Elmheim, smiling gently as though nothing unusual had happened. Julius remarked that the Elmheim family was bound together by blood and that family members should get along, directing the comment toward Alphine. The girl seated nearby fell silent in thought. There was something strangely familiar about her appearance, almost resembling Aster's younger sister, though her true identity remained uncertain. Their mother then spoke again with cold authority, declaring that House Elmheim's image of absolute power, the very force that had kept the knights under control for so long, was beginning to weaken because of the 7 wings. Her sharp gaze intensified as she ordered them to remind everyone that the emblem was not merely for decoration and to demonstrate the true meaning of brutality. Julius and Liliane slowly smiled in response, clearly understanding her intentions. Soon after, the scene shifted to the training grounds, where every candidate gathered with swords in hand. The sharp sounds of blades cutting through the air echoed constantly as the instructor stood before them with commanding authority, announcing that they had all been chosen as candidates for the kingdom's knights. The instructor explained that becoming a knight required far more than simply wielding a sword. It demanded mastery of combat, strategy, and every discipline necessary to surpass others. He emphasized that only those determined to become true elites could continue forward. To test them, a massive stone was placed before the candidates, and each person was ordered to shatter it using their sword. Smite stepped forward first, pouring all his strength into the task as training continued relentlessly. The instructor then revealed that the academy divided candidates into 6 ranks based on ability, with greater talent granting access to advanced techniques. He explained that wielding a moon sword earned someone 3rd rank, while mastering wiping magic elevated them to 1st rank. Meanwhile, Grion struggled desperately, unleashing repeated heat rays against the stone without success. In contrast, Nolan shattered it effortlessly, displaying the overwhelming gap between their abilities. Observing the results, the instructor reinforced the harsh reality that only those who mastered both swordsmanship and magic could stand among the true elite. He openly stated that there was nothing worth teaching to those who remained mediocre, and insisted that anyone seeking high-level techniques first needed to become worthy of them. He concluded by reminding everyone that constantly proving their strength was the only freedom they would ever be granted. The atmosphere shifted dramatically when Aster stepped forward. A powerful red aura erupted from his body and wrapped around both him and his sword. Without hesitation, he swung his blade once. The massive stone shattered instantly, the impact echoing across the training grounds and leaving the spectators stunned. Fear quietly spread among the onlookers as the instructor openly praised Astor's performance, declaring it the standard everyone else should strive to reach. Meanwhile, the other examiners reacted with visible irritation and jealousy, struggling to understand how such overwhelming power was possible. Above the training grounds, another instructor observed alongside Mimir. Recognizing Astor as the bearer of the seven-winged emblem, he noted that destroying a magical iron pillar comparable to a golem so effortlessly proved that Astor possessed extraordinary talent. However, he warned that the true power of the seven wings extended far beyond what Astor currently displayed, and cautioned that becoming satisfied with his present strength could lead to him being consumed by the dragon hidden within the academy. The scene then shifted once more, as Astor and Smite walked together while continuing their conversation. Smite reflected on the Academy's ranking system, realizing that even after passing the entrance exam, candidates continued to be judged constantly. He commented on how obsessed the kingdom's knights were with meritocracy, and pointed out that only Astor and Nolan had secured high ranks from the very beginning. Astor listened with a faint smile and acknowledged the harsh reality of the system, reflecting that anyone below the second rank could never become a kingdom knight. Because of that, he encouraged Smite to continue improving and catch up. Smite sighed in admiration and jokingly referred to Astor as boss. Astor immediately questioned the title with annoyance, but Smite leaned closer and reminded him of the bold declaration he had once made about destroying Elmheim. Those words had not been forgotten. According to Smite, people now placed their hopes in Astor and saw him as someone capable of changing their miserable lives. Smite insisted that Astor needed to act like a true leader, and confidently suggested that they should destroy Elmheim together. Astor responded with a faint but determined smile, realizing that if this was truly the path ahead of him, then he would need to grow far stronger than before. Just as the atmosphere reached its peak, the moment was abruptly interrupted by the loud growl of Smite's stomach. The tension instantly disappeared as Smite awkwardly admitted that they needed food before afternoon training because he would not survive otherwise. As they continued walking, Smite suddenly noticed a large group of examiners gathered in front of a particular room. Curious, he approached and wondered aloud whether the room was already full. The examiners immediately reacted upon seeing Astor, urgently calling out to him as though they had been waiting. Their behavior carried an unusual sense of anticipation, and the atmosphere grew heavy the moment the name Elmheim was mentioned from inside the room. The tension contrasted sharply with the sight of someone casually eating bread without concern. That individual acknowledged Astor's arrival and remarked that they had already started because he had taken too long. The moment the word brother was mentioned, everything became clear. Astor froze in shock as he recognized Julius Elmheim standing before him, accompanied by his younger sister Liliane. Their mere presence transformed the atmosphere entirely. Smite immediately became uneasy and nervously whispered that Julius's appearance likely meant something far worse was about to happen. Astor calmly confirmed his suspicion despite the tension visible on his face. Julius Elmheim, the second heir of the main family, carried immense authority and influence, while Liliane stood beside him with an equally infamous reputation. Together, their presence alone was enough to place overwhelming pressure on everyone in the room. Together, Julius and Liliane were known as the Tyrant Siblings, considered the most feared members of the Elmheim family. Smite processed their presence with quiet dread, realizing the situation had suddenly become far more dangerous. A bead of sweat slid down his face as the pressure in the room intensified. Liliane wore a chilling grin as she mocked Astor's appearance while insulting the so-called useless brother beside them. The atmosphere darkened further when Grion was revealed, pinned to the ground with an iron shackle forced onto his face. He groaned painfully beneath their feet while everyone stared in shock. Smite reacted in horror at the grotesque device, while Astor immediately recognized it as a brutal punishment tool used within Elmheim to mentally and physically break people. Julius looked down on Grion with contempt, admitting that although he once viewed him as a spoiled child, he now acknowledged that he possessed at least some understanding. Even so, Julius ridiculed Grion for carrying the Elmheim name while remaining only 6th rank, calling it disgraceful. Grabbing Grion by the mouth, Julius presented the torment as though it were an act of kindness meant to force improvement. Sweat poured down Grion's face as the pain worsened. Julius then announced to everyone that under such conditions, food, water, and even fresh air would become rewards. He warned that anyone could be driven to the brink of death, and declared that failure to remove the iron shackle would eventually result in death itself. Fear spread throughout the room as Julius's subordinates entered wearing identical iron shackles. Their eyes looked wild and beast-like, causing Smite to stutter in disbelief at the horrifying sight. Julius grinned proudly and ordered everyone else to recognize them as superiors. He then mockingly called for Alphine to step forward, describing the moment as an emotional reunion. A girl soon entered the room while also wearing an iron shackle. The instant Astor saw her, his entire body froze. Julius smiled calmly and commented on how much Astor had changed before revealing that the girl was Alphine, Astor's sister. Shock crashed over him immediately, followed by overwhelming rage. Without hesitation, Astor drew his sword while Alphine looked toward him with visible concern despite her own suffering. Julius remained completely unfazed by the tension and casually placed several more iron shackles in front of them, remarking that there were enough for everyone. He described the entire ordeal as a brutal welcome and mockingly encouraged them to relax while the cruelty unfolded around them. Beside him, Lillian shared the same sinister smile. Everyone else remained frozen in fear, unable to process the horrifying reality standing before them. Julius's subordinates moved instantly, surrounding Aster and his teammates from every direction until escape became impossible. Fear spread among the first-year students as they found themselves trapped against an overwhelming force. The enemies slowly closed in while Julius stood at a distance laughing confidently like someone who had already secured victory. Raising his voice, he ordered his followers to capture every one of them and reminded them that these were merely first-year students from Ironlead. He promised rewards to anyone who performed well and instructed them to place iron masks on the captives before bringing them to him. The moment his order ended, the attack began. Smite barely managed to react in time as a sword crashed toward him. He quickly blocked the strike, but the sheer force pushed him backward. Immediately, he realized how dangerous the situation truly was. These were upperclassmen far stronger than them. Everywhere Smite looked, his allies were struggling under the overwhelming pressure. Nolan fought desperately against multiple opponents at once, yet even he was gradually being overpowered. It became obvious that most of Julius's followers were 4th rank or higher, making the gap in strength painfully clear. Smite bitterly reflected that although he had always imagined standing against the Elmheim family one day, he never expected it to happen like this. The sudden ambush and crushing difference in power made the situation feel hopeless. Looking around at his exhausted companions, he realized that if things continued this way, they would all end up captured and forced to wear the same iron shackles. As anxiety grew inside him, Smite instinctively turned toward Aster, silently hoping he would do something before everything collapsed completely. At the same time, several enemies charged directly toward Aster, attempting to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. Unlike everyone else, however, Aster remained perfectly calm. His expression never changed as he stepped forward and swung his sword once in a single clean motion. Every attacker around him was blown away instantly and knocked unconscious. The battlefield itself seemed to pause after witnessing such overwhelming strength. Aster slowly lifted his gaze and turned his cold eyes toward Julius, demanding to know what he was truly trying to accomplish. Julius responded with an amused smile, casually referring to Aster as his cousin and telling him not to look so angry. He claimed that everything happening was simply his own version of kindness. According to Julius, most people lacked talent and survived only because of his mercy. He mocked them as worthless individuals, satisfied with merely being cadets. Julius continued arrogantly, insisting that if those at the bottom remained weak and mediocre, then even those standing at the top would lose their value. Since he viewed himself as someone destined to rule above others, he refused to tolerate weakness and claimed that was why he had personally chosen to take control through what he proudly called the Elmheim way. However, before he could continue further, Aster interrupted him sharply. He stated that he had never asked for an explanation in the first place. Julius blinked in confusion, but before he could react, Aster's expression hardened with determination. Mana erupted violently from his body, and his sword became engulfed in a blazing red aura. Without hesitation, he rushed directly toward Julius while demanding that he remove the filthy substance covering Alfine's mouth. Just before the attack could land, something completely unexpected happened. Alfine suddenly stepped between them and blocked Aster's strike herself. The sight instantly froze Aster in place. Julius, still smiling shamelessly behind her, calmly remarked that Aster should not hold a grudge and claimed that Alfine remained beside him by her own choice. He mockingly suggested that Aster ask her personally if he doubted it. Lillian laughed from the side and teasingly accused Aster of being cruel, clearly enjoying the confusion spreading across his face. Countless thoughts rushed through Aster's mind at once. He realized he had not heard from his sister in a long time, remembered how deeply worried their mother had been, and finally understood that something terrible had been happening behind the scenes the entire time. Without another word, Aster and Alfine suddenly charged toward each other at full speed. Their swords collided violently, sending sparks flying in every direction as their blades locked together. Amid the chaos, Aster desperately tried to reach her, admitting that although he did not fully understand what had happened, there was no reason for her to continue following someone like Julius. Nolan steps up to finish Aster's job by directly targeting Julius's head. He points his blade at the older Elmheim, who is even worse than Grion in his methods. Nolan demands that Julius draw his sword as he charges at full speed to cut down the siblings. But these siblings are not just for show. Julius catches the blade with his raw hands, questioning whether studying the sword truly makes one a better knight than the rest. With unending fury, he looms over Nolan, igniting flames that engulf his entire body. The intense heat is practically torture to endure while being gripped by Julius, who declares himself the strongest and most deserving of the knight title. With that, he kicks Nolan clean across the room, and that was no insignificant burn either. The man literally had half his face and arms scorched off. The burns are grueling. Smite comes to the rescue, but Lin Zhao is ecstatic to finish the job by trampling over the pride of these weaklings. She has already prepared a helmet as a special present reserved for Nolan, and she has no regard for Smite either. Julius makes it clear that being weak is a sin and that the ability to act freely is a privilege of the strong. Though Aster used his influence to gather allies, they are currently being demolished and slammed with helmets. That is the Elmheim way, where strength devours all. This leads Julius to question what Aster intends to do next. Aster launches at full speed against Julius, who casually dodges the sword swing. Julius then grabs Aster by the neck using the same technique he applied against Nolan and attempts to burn him to the ground. Smite worries for their boss while Julius expresses his disappointment in the might of the Seven Wings, calling Aster nothing more than a letdown. As he burns, Aster prepares his sword, warning Julius not to get cocky just because he managed to parry a single attack. With that confidence, Aster unleashes the Man-Storm to quell the flames Julius created, dispersing all of his magical power. The next swing is aimed right for Julius's neck, pushing him back with a spiraling vortex of both crimson and flame magic. Now free from the hold, Aster taunts Julius, telling him to go ahead and keep talking about how strength should silence the weak. Smite cannot believe what he just witnessed. Aster literally laid out the top dog of the academy. But Aster understands the fight is far from over. Julius gets back up, and despite claiming the last attack hurt him, he dusts himself off without a scratch, taunting Aster for failing to even graze his crest. Smite realizes nothing actually happened to Julius. Lillian smiles, remarking that she was never worried to begin with, and mocks Julius for getting countered after running his mouth. Julius, however, takes it in stride, until Aster calls him a piece of trash, at which point he blazes up in pure fury. He points his fiery blade at the Viscount's son, accusing him of getting arrogant in their little game and assuring him that this will be his grave. Aster is not the least bit intimidated, telling Julius to stop with the empty threats and just attack already. Just as their duel is about to begin for round 2, a certain director arrives and puts a stop to the madness. It is Earl Mays who reminds them that the cafeteria is for eating, not for destroying. Even as a director, he cannot stand by and watch this continue. Julius thinks he owns the place, ordering even the director to stay out of their business. Earl Mays does not let the insult affect him, instead taunting Julius back by pointing out that a first-grade top candidate getting worked up over an inferior person only damages his own reputation. He comes to Aster's aid, framing it as though Aster needed his help, which causes Julius to finally put away his sword. Julius then orders his men to fall back, declaring that their little welcome party is wrapped up. The situation is not resolved to Aster's satisfaction, as the director urges him to stand down for now. What truly bothers Aster is seeing his sister side with the enemy. He calls out to Alphen, who gives him the coldest side-eye before walking away as though he were nothing but a nuisance. It genuinely saddens him to see her treated that way. Afterward, Aster's group gathers to discuss the reality check they received going up against the Elmheims, especially after Nolan got the Todoroki treatment. Even some of their own comrades were dragged into it because of the masks. Their next move remains undecided. Aster is particularly frustrated that Earl Mays allowed things to deteriorate this far. His assistant calls Earl Mays out for showing no basic respect toward the very man who stopped the fight, but Earl Mays brushes it off, reminding Aster that the two of them go way back, that when Aster was first summoned to the main house he was the only one who stood by him. Whether Earl Mays is truly a friend or an enemy remains unclear. Smite raises the question of how, if this man is truly a director, the Elmheims have been allowed to dominate the entire academy. Earl Mays clarifies that he too belongs to the same house, and does not involve himself in family affairs unless absolutely necessary. Aster finds it unacceptable that nothing is being done about Julius forcing students to wear those torturous masks. But as Earl Mays explains, this has always been the state of the academy. It operates on meritocracy. Any method that forces growth in the inferiors is considered acceptable. The students under Julius's command actually see their progress and grades shoot up, and even the principal approves of it. This confirms to Aster that he is completely alone in this fight, and cannot rely on those above him. Earl Mays recognizes that Aster is being reckless and is likely planning to march straight into the enemy's base. He warns Aster that every move he makes is being watched closely by the main family, and that they are waiting for him to slip up so they can force his expulsion. But not even that is enough to stop Aster from doing what is right. It is not even about justice. It is about the iron shackle itself, a tool that corrodes the soul of whoever wears it, turning them into a literal slave by stripping away their words, their self-respect, and even their will to resist. Aster speaks about it with such familiarity that Earl Mays is visibly shocked, wondering aloud whether Aster has experienced something like it before. Aster vaguely confirms that he has witnessed something horrific of that nature, and refuses to let his friends suffer the same fate. Earl Mays is surprised when Aster, the youngest son of the Viscounties, states that he has no intention of getting expelled, and that a peaceful resolution is preferable. Aster holds up the iron shackle and reminds the director that he too has his own way of fighting, his own ninja way. 3 days pass in the blink of an eye. Smite and the others train relentlessly in hardcore combat. Nolan shockingly has recovered to full health without a single trace of scarring. He refuses to rest, insisting on going full speed through the curriculum from the very start, and calling his earlier injuries a mere scratch. Smite is practically dying from the training, but the one they should all be most worried about is Aster, who is bolting ahead seemingly without limits, and likely losing his mind from wearing that shackle. 3 days prior, Aster had gone directly to find Julius. Despite their previous duel, the siblings were not willing to forgive him. But the fact that he came to make a deal was something else entirely. Julius gulps down his wine and sneers at him. Aster calmly explains that he wants his sister and his friends released, and that in exchange he will allow them to place the shackle on him instead. That is his only condition. Alphen is mortified, insisting that he has lost his mind. Aster further argues that a rebellion is already underway, and that placing the shackle on the main rebel is the fastest way for the family to take control. Lillian is stunned that he is willingly offering himself up as a pet, wondering aloud if he has some kind of masochistic streak. Julius acknowledges that Aster has been a genuine obstacle and that the directors would love to see him brought down a notch, but he is clearly surprised that the boy is submitting this willingly. Aster assures him there are no ulterior motives, noting that the mask is sealed with a magical inscription that only the Elmheims can unlock, meaning they can kill him at any moment they choose. He then cleverly taunts Julius, questioning whether he is afraid that he cannot brainwash him even with the shackle on. That single remark causes Julius to flare up, melting the wine bottle in his hand. He takes the bet, but adds one final condition. He demands that Aster wear the shackle for 10 full days without receiving a single drop of water or a bite of food, and that if the boy survives, he will set them all free. It is a brutal deal, and even Alphen urges Aster to refuse. It is practically designed to kill him, but Aster accepts the condition. He knows the shackle will corrode his soul, and he knows it has always been the family's tool of control. But he refuses to let someone like Alphen be broken by it. She is the most fragile among them, yet carries the strongest resolve, and someone like her cannot resist the shackle. She looks at him with pity, but Aster assures his sister that he will break the chains. Lillian steps forward with a smile and imbues her energy into the tool. Back in the present, the examiner berates the group for slacking during training. Even Gree begins to complain about receiving the same punishment as the others. Smite points out that the instructors show no leniency just because of the masks, and Nolan rubs it in, calling it karma. What shocks everyone is how Aster, even after several days without food or water, continues to blitz through training with seemingly endless energy. No ordinary person should be able to endure that for more than a day, let alone a week. Nolan suspects his friend has already hit his limit and is simply bluffing. He recalls an old rumor that before Aster was taken in by the Viscount, the child had crawled several miles on his own through snow-buried mountains. That is why his life force is far beyond that of an average human. Even so, Aster appears to be holding up a facade. Meanwhile, Lillian keeps her collection of pets locked in the dungeon, bringing them just enough food and water to keep them alive. She unlocks their masks and serves each of them a single cup of water alongside a scrap of cheese. Even Jian protests, arguing that what little food they are given is not nearly enough to sustain them. Lillian responds by smashing the piece of cheese right in front of him. She then reminds them all not to end up like the boy in the corner. Aster, the only one among them forbidden from eating or drinking anything. Julius enjoys watching them suffer, even urging Alphen to go cheer on her brother. But given her current state, she cannot bring herself to face him. What bothers Julius the most is that Aster still has not cracked. Julius remains confident, assuring himself that he will tear the arrogance out of Aster's eyes before long. Powering mana into one's blade creates a razor-sharp pulsing edge, increasing the weapon's power, while channeling it through the body creates an armor-like enhanced state. Mana is flexible in its application. Used in the legs, it boosts speed beyond that of a horse. Focused on perception, it sharpens the senses to detect enemies, and unleashed in an overwhelming surge, it can act as a trump card to turn the tide of battle. Aster demonstrates this by manipulating the wind and launching himself into the sky, flanking the flankers before descending with a crushing blow that knocks the wind out of both targets. In the 4th grade curriculum, students are expected to master specialized mana manipulation, and sword usage is restricted during this period. Even without a blade, those possessing a crest can eliminate creatures with ease, as the examiner demonstrates by killing a bird with a single finger blast. 7 full days have passed since Aster took on the Iron Shackle, and several days since the hellish training began. He has now developed a strong grasp of mana manipulation in unarmed combat. 3 days remain until the promised deadline, and if he can endure until then, his sister and the others will be freed. But Aster knows that passively waiting is not enough. Julius did not even draw his sword during their last encounter and was still overwhelmingly powerful. He has not even shown his full abilities yet. Aster is up against a 1st grade top-tier combatant, and despite his exhaustion, he pushes himself to find any knowledge or advantage that could bring him victory. Then his body finally gives out. Dizziness and weakness hit him all at once, and he collapses to the ground. Nolan rushes over and checks on him, realizing Aster has developed a fever. Earl Mays had anticipated something like this might happen, which is why he had tasked Nolan with keeping a close eye on Aster, in case things took a turn for the worse. Nolan moves to grab his sword and crack the shackle, but Aster grabs his arm and refuses to let him. Death is hovering over him, yet his gaze of pure agony and determination silently pleads with Nolan not to ruin this, that he needs to save his sister. Though Nolan cannot fully understand, he grasps the weight of the situation and holds back. But their enemies have no intention of playing fair. Lillian has gathered her men to corner her brother now that he is finally at the brink of breaking down. She mocks him, calling him an undead who deserves to be put down for wandering around in that state. Nolan fires back, demanding to know what a 2nd grader is doing interfering with 4th grade training. Lillian brushes it off, insisting she is simply there for a class visit with her companions. The instructor raises no objection. She perches on a tree branch to get a better view. Eagerly waiting for the moment, Aster drops to his knees and begs for mercy. She commands her men to cut them down to their heart's content. Their goal is simple: eliminate Aster before he can reach the deadline. Nolan covers Aster from behind, blocking incoming attacks. Without their swords, it becomes a battle of fists, and their output is severely limited. Aster has one trump card available, but has not yet thought to use it. Even Lilian knows these sword warriors are at their weakest without their weapons, and relishes watching Aster wear himself down further. Nolan holds his own, but Aster's dulled senses leave him blind to a man charging at him from behind. The attacker tackles him with full ferocity, headbutting him so hard that blood spills from beneath the mask, sending Aster crashing into a tree. Nolan fears the worst, but Lilian is not finished. She wants him crippled and barely alive so she can make him her pet. In his final moments of consciousness, Aster suddenly snaps back to his senses and releases a wave of wind-cutter blades, slashing and tearing apart the attacker in front of him. The sudden display of power wipes the confidence clean off Lilian's face. A moment later, Aster slowly rose to his feet. The powerful energy surrounding him had not faded at all. Instead, it continued to surge from his body like an invisible storm. Seeing this, one of the students narrowed his eyes and declared that it appeared to be some kind of mana defense. He remarked that although it seemed weak, if that was all Aster could manage, he was confident he could crush him again. The student immediately charged forward at incredible speed, intending to overwhelm Aster once more. As Aster watched him rushing in, he calmly released even more of his energy and extended one hand straight ahead. The moment the attacker reached him, Aster stopped him with that single outstretched hand. At the same instant, the strange energy surrounding Aster erupted. Countless cuts and slashes suddenly appeared across the student's body, as though invisible blades were striking him from every direction. Blood sprayed through the air as new wounds opened across his arms, chest, and shoulders. Unable to withstand the assault, the student collapsed to the ground almost immediately. Everyone present witnessed the entire scene unfold. After seeing what had happened, Linian felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time, genuine fear began to creep into her heart. Staring at Aster in disbelief, the thought crossed her mind that it could not be possible. She wondered with growing unease whether someone who had been considered utterly useless was already capable of using attribute change. At that very moment, several more students rushed forward together, preparing to attack Aster from all sides. Meanwhile, Aster remained completely focused as he stood surrounded by the energy flowing from his body. His mind rapidly analyzed what he was experiencing. Deep inside, he realized that this power was fundamentally different from the techniques he had learned before. It bore no resemblance to basic concepts such as strengthening a weapon or reinforcing one's own body. And as the next wave of opponents closed in, it became increasingly obvious that what they were facing was no longer the same powerless boy they had once mocked. After releasing an incredibly powerful slash, Aster finally began to understand the true nature of the ability he had awakened. As the energy flowed around him, the realization settled in his mind. It was a variant of mana control, one that carried its own distinct attribute. His eyes narrowed as the understanding deepened, reminding him of something his older brother had once demonstrated. Just as fire-attributed magical power burns everything it touches, this power cut through everything it touched. It was mana with a cut attribute. His mana itself had taken on the property of severing, so that anything coming into contact with it would be subjected to that very nature. To test his understanding, Aster immediately stretched one hand forward. In the next instant, a terrifying scene unfolded without him even making physical contact. A large tree standing ahead of him was instantly sliced apart. The entire trunk split into countless tiny fragments, breaking apart as though shredded by thousands of invisible blades. Before everyone's eyes, the surrounding students froze. Fear quickly spread across their faces. Moments ago, they had looked down on Aster as someone weak and useless. But now, after witnessing a massive tree reduced to splinters by a single motion of his hand, none of them could remain calm. After reaching that realization, Aster did not hesitate any longer. The remaining students were still struggling to process what they had just witnessed when he suddenly moved. Aster launched himself forward and attacked them one after another. Invisible slashes swept across the battlefield, and every movement of his body carried the terrifying force of the cut attribute. Students who tried to block were overwhelmed. Those who attempted to dodge were still caught by the relentless cutting force that permeated his mana. Their confidence, arrogance, and determination were all shattered as Aster relentlessly overpowered every single opponent standing before him. Within moments, the battlefield had fallen silent. Standing off to the side, Nolan watched the entire scene unfold, his gaze fixed on Aster as countless thoughts moved through his mind. The extraordinary growth Aster had displayed left Nolan quietly questioning himself, wondering in silence whether Aster still stood one step ahead of him. 7 wings. Linian then jumped down from the tree and surveyed the battlefield with a cold smile. She remarked that it was not bad, admitting she had not expected him to come this far, but she pointed out that despite how impressive it looked, he had not killed a single person and questioned whether he truly believed that would be enough to stop her soldiers. As she spoke, she stood with one foot planted on a fallen man's body, slowly drawing her sword. She looked down at him with complete disdain and coldly ordered him to get up. Without hesitation, she swung her blade and attacked the man in front of her. Meanwhile, Aster and Nolan remained standing nearby, silently watching everything unfold. At that very moment, something unexpected happened. Cracks suddenly began spreading across the masks worn by the controlled students. One after another, the masks shattered and fell to the ground, fragments scattering in every direction. As the students finally revealed their faces, Lilian's eyes widened in shock. This was something she had never anticipated. The students looked around in confusion, before expressions of relief gradually appeared on their faces. One of them noted with quiet relief that the mask had come off, and that he could finally breathe freely again. Watching the scene, Nolan turned his gaze toward Aster. A look of surprise crossed his face as it occurred to him that in the middle of that fierce battle, Aster had actually managed to reach that point. The result of Aster's efforts was now becoming clear. However, Lillian immediately tried to regain control of the situation. Her voice grew sharper as she glared at the freed students. She reminded them with cold arrogance that they were well aware of their position, adding that whatever help they imagined was being offered to them amounted to nothing. But this time, her words had no effect. Not a single student moved. No one reached for their mask. No one obeyed her command. The silence that followed only made her more uneasy. Hesitation flickered across her face as panic slowly began to creep into her mind. She raised her voice and demanded to know what they were doing, ordering them to put the masks back on immediately. Yet even after shouting at the top of her lungs, nobody listened. The students simply stood where they were, no longer under her control. For the first time, genuine fear and confusion appeared in Lillian's expression. The authority she had relied upon so confidently was crumbling right before her eyes. Standing a short distance away, Nolan watched the scene calmly. Then, with a faint smile, he observed that even after the iron shackles had been removed, she still expected them to obey. His eyes remained fixed on Aster. The students had finally broken free from their chains, and the influence controlling them was fading away. What Lillian had believed to be absolute obedience had turned out to be far more fragile than she imagined. As her control slipped away piece by piece, the battlefield began shifting in a direction she could no longer predict. Nolan remarked quietly that it seemed Aster's nature was not completely rotten after all. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his head. The intense headache forced him to stagger. Nolan immediately noticed something was wrong and quickly moved toward him, but before he could reach Aster, someone else arrived first. Alphen rushed forward and caught Aster before he could collapse. As she held him, countless emotions surged through her heart. Her voice trembled slightly as she called him completely crazy, saying that he had always been so reckless. Tears began gathering in her eyes. She lowered her head and apologized, confessing that even though she was his older sister, he had always been the one looking after her. Memories of the past flooded her mind. Every moment he had supported her, every time he had given her strength, every instance he had stood by her side despite everything. A gentle smile appeared on her face as she told him that he had already given her all the courage she needed, and that she was going to be okay. Those were the last words Aster heard before his consciousness faded away. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on a bed. The darkness outside the window told him it was already night. For several moments, he simply stared at the ceiling in confusion. He wondered where he was. Then something on the nearby table caught his attention. A letter. His expression instantly changed and a sense of unease crept into his chest. He quickly reached for the envelope. The word sister crossed his mind the moment he recognized who it was from, and his heartbeat immediately quickened. Aster opened the letter at once, anxiety spreading across his face. His hands trembled slightly as he whispered to himself, pleading inwardly that it not be what he feared. He tore out of the room the moment he finished reading it. The Count's voice cut through the air from behind, stopping Aster sharply in his tracks. He demanded to know where Aster thought he was going in such a hurry, reminding him that he was in no condition to be walking around, let alone running. Aster froze. The Count's eyes dropped to the letter still clutched in his hand. He took it and began reading it himself. The letter, written by Alphen, expressed her gratitude toward Aster along with an apology for having been such a cowardly sister, one who had been forced for once to try and be brave. She added that it was now her turn to save him, just as he had protected her during the sword dance festival. Aster's thoughts churned with dread. He cursed the situation inwardly, and pleaded silently for Alphen not to do anything reckless. He regretted ever putting on the iron shackle, knowing he had never intended for her to be driven to such desperate action. The thought of something happening to her was unbearable. It would make everything he had endured up to that point utterly meaningless. Driven by that urgency, Aster rushed straight toward Lillian and Julius's residence. Upon arriving, he was shocked to find Alphen lying injured and unconscious on the ground. Lillian stood nearby, letting out a slow, lazy yawn as though nothing of any consequence had taken place. She noted that it was Aster this time, and remarked that it was nearly past her bedtime, criticizing the fact that both siblings apparently had no sense of manners. Aster immediately ran to Alphen's side and urged her to hold on. Visibly shaken by her condition, he looked up at Lillian, who casually explained that Alphen had come there to beg for his release, convinced he was going to die. She described how that usually timid girl, who had never once raised a complaint until now, had suddenly shown up wearing a determined expression. That shift in attitude had irritated her, so she had decided to toy with Alphen for a while, and she finished the explanation with a faint grin. Aster locked a death glare onto her. His anger barely restrained, Lillian responded without concern, noting that it had helped her blow off some steam and that she had already been annoyed with him as well. She added that thanks to everything that had happened, she expected to sleep very well that night. Watching her, Aster reflected inwardly that he had been far too lenient from the very beginning. He regretted not having acted with more force, believing he should have dragged them out by any means necessary rather than attempting to negotiate. Had he done so, his sister would never have been pushed into doing something so reckless. As his emotions churned beneath the surface, Aster's mind drifted back to words his father had spoken to them long ago. His father had told them to listen carefully, that a knight must endure any absurdity and remain patient regardless of status, position, or the outcome of a mission. He'd explained that when considering what truly needs to be protected, choosing not to fight is sometimes the wisest course of action, and that understanding this was what it truly meant to be a knight. The memory continued, carrying with it his father's warning that even if one is spat upon or cut down, they must never lash out from raw emotion alone. Astor recalled questioning whether that meant they were simply supposed to accept every attack without resistance. His father had corrected him. It was never about passive acceptance, but about never losing sight of one's purpose or misreading the moment to act. He had pressed them to always keep the answers clear in their minds, why they took up the sword and why they chose to fight. Those words echoed through Astor now, and with them came the understanding that when the true moment to draw the blade finally arrives, one must do so without the slightest hesitation. He concluded that he had been far too slow and that he should have acted from the very beginning. With that realization burning through him, Astor drove his sword into the ground. An overwhelming fire aura erupted from his body, forcing Lillian, Julius, and their surrounding slaves to stagger backward, completely overwhelmed by the pressure. Astor's expression hardened, his eyes carrying a killing intent so concentrated it was almost tangible. He declared that he should have wiped them out from the start, eradicated every last one of them without leaving a single trace of Elmheim blood behind. His words made his intention unmistakably clear. As Astor's overwhelming aura surged once more, Alphen immediately recognized the terrifying sensation. The immense pressure flooding the battlefield reminded her of an incident she had prayed she would never witness again. Fear filled her eyes as she silently urged him not to go down that path. To her, this felt exactly like that dreadful moment from before. The sheer magnitude of Astor's mana spread far beyond the battlefield. Its presence was so overwhelming that people throughout the surrounding area could feel it from within their own homes. The tremendous magical pressure reached every corner of the region, leaving countless individuals stunned, and found himself wondering whether Astor had truly gone berserk. As the immense mana continued to engulf the surroundings, the scene returned to Astor himself. Despite his terrifying state, he carefully laid Alphen down to the side, positioning her somewhere comfortable and safe. Only after ensuring she was secure did he turn his full attention toward Lillian. Without wasting a single moment, Astor launched himself forward at incredible speed. The sudden violence of his movement sent genuine terror through Lillian. In the next instant, he swung his sword with overwhelming killing intent, driving a devastating strike directly toward her. However, before the blow could reach its target, Julius stepped in and intercepted it. He blocked Astor's sword and revealed a smirk as he finally witnessed the true extent of Astor's power firsthand. Julius recognized it immediately as the Seven Wings, and understood at once why Astor had drawn so much attention. He remarked that he finally understood why those old men had taken such a liking to him, and acknowledged the unbelievable amount of power Astor was still releasing despite standing on the verge of death. At the same time, Julius pointed out the contradiction in Astor's actions, that he had endured endless suffering to protect those around him, yet was now throwing himself into a battle that threatened to destroy everything he had struggled to preserve. With those words delivered, Julius drove Astor backward with force, creating distance between them, but Astor refused to yield. The moment he regained his footing, he charged forward again at full speed, his eyes fixed on Julius without a trace of hesitation. Watching his relentless advance, Julius smirked and remarked that it seemed Astor had forgotten how to speak. As the confrontation escalated, Julius revealed what had been weighing on his mind throughout. He admitted that crushing Astor himself had always been a necessity, that this battle had become inevitable, and that there was only one way it could end. He declared that they would settle everything through a reignited flame. As the two clashed, an intense burst of mana erupted from both of them. The surrounding students were running, with one stating that they would get caught in the crossfire if they stayed any longer. Lynch wondered how their boy could stand his ground against Julius. Even Griot was shocked, expressing that Astor had never shown that kind of mana when facing him before. But Astor had only one thing on his mind right now: to go all out and defeat everyone who had hurt his sister. Alphen was sent flying into the nearby wall, unconscious. Julius thought to himself, wondering how he could have let Alphen get launched by their aura and get hurt, when just moments earlier he had been losing his mind over her. Julius wondered what their boy was even mad about. Inside Astor's mind, all he could think of was to eradicate and wipe out all of them, every last drop of their Elmheim blood. Astor took a Spider-Man pose. Julius, seeing this, sensed that his own mana was being stripped away by Astor. Julius launched himself forward, stating that he would not give Astor that kind of luxury. Linshin suddenly shouted for Julius to watch out. Suddenly, Astor lifted his sword, and his mana had cut into the ground and everything it touched, shocking Julius in the process. The mana reached him, cutting away all the furniture and Julius' clothes. Standing there, Julius emitted his own mana. He stated that a slashing mana attribute was extremely rare. He was now extremely angry, and even added that this was the first time he had felt that someone's mana could actually kill him. But he also stated that his own mana was not just about heat, and that his own mana could also kill. The heat alone made Astor sweat uncontrollably. Julius even bragged that just by standing there he could make everyone lose the will to resist his heat, and that the person who could withstand his heat long enough was truly strong. But the surrounding soldiers were not strong, as they struggled to resist the heat Julius emitted. Julius added that resisting him was their own fault. Finally, Astor spoke, stating that it would only matter if he were the only one left standing at the end, before emitting his own aura. Julius charged once again and mocked him, stating that their boy was more than just a growl, but what he was doing right now was useless, nothing more than a pathetic struggle. The two swords clashed once again, one emitting heat that melted everything around him, and the other emitting an aura that cut everything it touched, even himself. As Aster was pushed back, his own mana was cutting into him, to which Lillian remarked that it was gross to have a power that hurt even his own body just to keep fighting. Elifine weakly called out Aster's name in worry. She remembered 7 years ago when the same thing had happened to Aster, leaving him in a similar state. Back then, their father had put his life on the line to stop Aster, but after that happened, Aster had started keeping his distance from them, and their father had stated that it was the 7 wings going berserk. But to Alphen, she believed Aster simply couldn't forgive himself, and that he had thought it was because he was weak, and that it had led him to hurting his own family. The scene shifted to the present, where Aster clashed swords with Julius. Alphen tried to get up, as she wondered to herself why Aster always pointed the blade at himself to protect them. Aster was finally pushed back to the ground. Julius said he appreciated the effort, and that his will to fight was something else, but he should already be dead because looking at someone as stubborn as Aster only angered Julius further. But suddenly Julius' swords fell from his grip, his hand suddenly erupted with multiple cuts. He wondered when he had gotten this wound, and noted that he couldn't feel any strength in his arm. Then Sony slowly got up, and as he did his masked face started showing cracks, and in the next moment it fell off. Aster's rage exploded once again, as he shouted Julius' name. Julius was now shocked at how Aster still had strength, and realized the situation was getting really bad for him. Aster suddenly charged forward at Julius, extending his hand to attack him.